The train arrived 20 minutes late, which suited Evelyn Harper just fine. 20 minutes was 20 minutes more she didn't have to stand on a Wyoming platform in January with 9 children and a carpet bag that had seen better days, better years, really, and face whatever it was that waited for her in Caldwell Creek. She'd heard about the town from a woman named Dorothea Price on the train from Cheyenne, a stout, well-meaning woman who'd sat across from her in the second-class car and spent the better part of 2 hours telling Evelyn everything she needed to know about the territory. Dorothea had a sister who'd married a cattle rancher in Caldwell Creek, and according to Dorothea, the town held an arrangement, not entirely uncommon on the frontier, where ranchers looking for wives could make themselves known at the station platform on the first Saturday of every month. Women came from as far as Missouri. Some came from Ohio. A few, Dorothea said, had come all the way from Philadelphia, though she couldn't imagine why a Philadelphia woman would want to freeze to death in Wyoming. They hold it at noon, Dorothea had told her, picking at the biscuit she'd brought in a handkerchief from somewhere. The ranchers line up on the south side of the platform. The women stand on the north side. Reverend Callahan introduces them, though he's getting on in years and tends to mispronounce things. It's not romantic, mind you. It's practical. Out here, practical is what survives. Evelyn had nodded and said nothing about the children. She hadn't exactly been hiding them. They were in the next car back, the one with the broken heating vent, because there wasn't room enough in second class for all of them to sit together, and splitting them had seemed the only reasonable thing to do. Her oldest, Clara, 17 and steady as iron, was back there keeping watch. Evelyn had checked on them twice before Dorothea started talking and hadn't been able to get away politely after that. Now, standing on the platform at Caldwell Creek, with the first stiff bite of wind cutting through her coat, a coat that had been good quality 8 years ago, which was the last time she'd bought anything that could be called good quality, Evelyn watched the other women arrange themselves with the practiced ease of people who knew what they were doing. There were 6 of them, not counting Evelyn. 2 were young, maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of clean complexions that came from having never truly gone without. One was a handsome woman in her 30s with red hair pinned so tightly under her hat that it must have hurt. Another 2 were closer to Evelyn's age, 34, and carried themselves with the careful dignity of women who'd lost something significant and were trying to rebuild without showing the seams. The last was a quiet woman who kept looking down the track as though she was still deciding whether to stay. None of them had 9 children. Evelyn turned back to the car where Clara was herding the others down the iron steps. They came in order, the way she'd trained them to move in public. Not because she was rigid, but because chaos drew attention, and attention on a platform like this was the last thing she needed right now. Clara first, dark-haired and serious, holding 6-year-old Iris by the hand. Then Wyatt, 15 and scowling at the platform railing as though it had personally offended him. Then the twins, Thomas and George, 11 years old and physically incapable of going 5 minutes without elbowing each other. Then May, 9, who was carrying her little cloth rabbit and looking at everything with enormous brown eyes. Then Daniel, 8, whose left boot had a cracked sole that Evelyn had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. Then Sophie, 5, who rarely spoke but watched everything with an unsettling attentiveness. Then Henry, 3. And finally little Peter, barely 2, whom Clara passed down to Evelyn's arms before climbing off herself. Evelyn adjusted Peter on her hip and looked at the platform. The other women had gone very still. She heard a sound from somewhere behind the group, a dry, low laugh that she couldn't locate, didn't try to. "Lord Almighty," she heard someone mutter. A man's voice. She didn't look. The platform was maybe 60 feet long. The south side, where the ranchers stood, had maybe 8 men. She'd counted from the car window before the train stopped. They were spread out with the unconscious confidence of men who understood that they were the ones with the power in this particular arrangement. They were the ones with land and shelter and steady incomes, and the women were here because they needed those things. Evelyn understood the math. She'd done it herself, alone in the room she'd rented in Cheyenne for 2 weeks, while she figured out what on earth she was going to do next. She'd been left with nothing. Not nothing like people meant sometimes when they said nothing but meant less than they wanted. She meant nothing with teeth in it. Her second husband, Robert, had been a decent man in the way that some men were decent without being particularly useful. He'd died 18 months ago of a lung infection, leaving behind a small general store that turned out to have debts Evelyn hadn't known about. She'd sold everything that wasn't already owed to someone, paid what she could, and still came up short. Before Robert, there had been William, her first husband and the father of the older five, who died when a barn collapsed on him 7 years ago. She'd rebuilt after William. She didn't know if she had it in her to rebuild again, but the children didn't give her the option of deciding otherwise. A stout man in a brown coat, not one of the ranchers, more like an official of some kind, walked to the center of the platform with the measured gait of someone who'd done this many times before. "Good afternoon," he said too loudly. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Elkins. I'll be facilitating introductions today in place of Reverend Callahan, who is, indisposed." He cleared his throat. "We'll proceed with the north side making themselves known, and then the gentlemen on the south side can make inquiries as they see fit. We keep things civil and orderly here. Any questions?" No one had questions. He started at the far end of the north side with the youngest of the women and worked his way down. The introductions were short and awkward. Each woman gave her name, her home state, and some brief accounting of herself. The red-haired woman mentioned she was a school teacher. One of the younger ones mentioned her father had owned a farm. The quiet woman at the end said almost nothing and stared at the railing. Then Elkins got to Evelyn. She kept Peter on her hip. Claire had lined the children up just behind her, which she'd told them to do. She could feel Wyatt's resistant energy even without looking. That particular kind of 15-year-old tension that had no specific target because it had every target. "Evelyn Harper," she said, "from Sioux Falls originally, most recently from Cheyenne." Elkins nodded, started to move on. "And these are my children," she said, louder than she'd intended. She wasn't sure why she said it that way, except that she wasn't going to let it come out like a confession later. Elkins stopped. The platform got quieter in a way that wasn't actually silence. The wind was still coming, and there were horses somewhere, and someone's luggage was being dragged across the boards. But the particular noise of human attention shifted. People were looking. "How many?" Elkins said. "9. She heard the woman with red hair make a soft sound. Not unkind exactly. More like someone stepping on a stair that turned out to be missing. Elkins blinked. He was a man who clearly prided himself on maintaining composure in awkward situations. His job probably required it, but 9 was a number that took a moment to absorb. He looked down the line of children. Counted, she thought, though he stopped himself from being too obvious about it. "I see," he said. "Their ages run from 2 to 17, she said, because she might as well. They're all healthy. They know how to work." She said it plainly, the way you'd state the condition of a property you were selling. She wasn't ashamed of her children. She was just aware that what she was doing on this platform was, at its core, a transaction. And she'd found in her 34 years that treating a transaction like something it wasn't only made things harder. Elkins moved on. The last woman, the quiet one, gave her name as Harriet something, and then Elkins stepped back and the men were free to move. They didn't rush. They never did, from what Dorothea had described. They drifted across the platform the way cattle drifted toward water. With purpose, but without hurry, because they were the ones who got to choose. Evelyn watched them go to the other women. The youngest two received the most immediate attention. The school teacher was approached by a lean, weathered man who took off his hat first, which was a good sign. The quiet woman, Harriet, was approached by a shorter man who spoke very gently to her, and she looked up for the first time and said something back. No one came to Evelyn's side of the platform. She hadn't expected them to rush. She told herself that. She watched Clara, who was watching the men with careful eyes, her expression giving nothing away. She watched Wyatt, who was staring at the railing again, jaw set. Thomas and George had started poking each other in the ribs, low enough that she couldn't easily reprimand them without causing a scene, so she let it go. May was still holding her rabbit. Daniel had found a crack in the platform boards and was pressing his cracked-soled boot against it with focused interest. Sophie stood completely still, watching everything. Peter had fallen asleep against her shoulder. After about 10 minutes, one of the ranchers came over. He was maybe 50, thick-necked, with a beard that needed trimming. He looked at the children first, then at Evelyn, then back at the children. "How many of those are yours?" he said. "All of them," Evelyn said. He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man doing math in his head that wasn't working out. "I run a cattle operation," he said. 1,700 acres. Good land. That's a substantial spread, she said. I need a wife who can manage the house, cook for 6 ranch hands, keep things running. I can do that. He looked at the children again, at Thomas, who had just jabbed George in the ear, and at George, who looked like he was considering retaliation. I got a small house, the man said. 2 rooms. Evelyn said nothing. He pulled at his beard. 9 children, he said, more to himself than to her. Yes, she said. I appreciate you being straight with me. He stepped back. I don't think I can do right by that situation, ma'am. I'm sorry. He walked away. Not unkindly, but he walked away. The second man who came over didn't even make it to a full conversation. He got close enough to see the line of children, stopped walking, and turned back with the defeated air of a man who just remembered a prior engagement. The third man asked her age, listened to the answer, asked how her previous husbands had died, and then said, not without sympathy, that he wasn't sure he was up to the challenge. She thanked him. He left. She was aware of people watching from the far end of the platform, a few townspeople who'd come to observe, which Dorothea had mentioned was common, because there wasn't much entertainment in Caldwell Creek in January. She could hear a few of them talking, not quite low enough. 9 children, someone said. Who'd take that on? Nobody reasonable. She's not bad looking. For a widow with 9, doesn't matter how she looks. 9 children's 9 children. Evelyn kept her eyes ahead. The wind had picked up. The sky was doing something in the northwest, a particular darkening that people who'd lived in this country long enough learned to read without wanting to. Evelyn had lived in South Dakota for 12 years before Cheyenne. She read it fine. Mrs. Harper. She turned. Elkins was standing a few feet away with the expression of a man who'd drawn the short straw and knew it. It's getting on in the afternoon, he said carefully. The arrangements... He paused. There's a boarding house on Morrow Street. Mrs. Glennie keeps it. She's reasonable. He was telling her as gently as he could that it was over for today, that she should find a place to sleep and perhaps come back next month, though they both probably understood that next month wouldn't be different. I'm not leaving yet, she said. Elkins looked at the sky, looked at the children. Ma'am, the weather... I can see the weather, she said. He hesitated, then nodded once and stepped back. She understood what she was doing. She understood that staying on a platform as a blizzard came in, with 2-year-old Peter asleep on her shoulder and Sophie standing motionless behind her, and the twins now fully engaged in a silent war of attrition, was not a dignified picture. She understood that the people watching from the far end were watching with a mixture of pity and something that she refused to call amusement, though it was close to that. But she didn't have the money for Mrs. Glennie's boarding house. Not for a night, not for 2 people, certainly not for 11. She had $7.40 in her coat pocket, and she'd been turning it over in her mind all the way from Cheyenne, running numbers that didn't add up no matter how she arranged them. And she was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, the kind that came from losing 2 husbands and 1 general store and a house in Sioux Falls, and the quiet life she'd pictured when she was 18 and thought she understood how things worked. That kind of tired was in her bones, and the last thing she was willing to do with it was stand in front of a man she didn't know and ask him to feel sorry for her. She wasn't here for sympathy. She was here for a chance. Clara came up beside her, quiet as always. Clara had her mother's eyes, that specific dark gray that looked brown in some light, and a composure that was too old for 17, formed in the same difficult furnace that had shaped everything in this family. Mama, she said, low enough that only Evelyn heard. The twins need to eat. I know. And Sophie... I know, Clara. A pause. Then Clara, who had never been one for empty comfort. There's nobody left on the south side. Evelyn looked. The south side of the platform was emptying. The ranchers were drifting toward the street, toward their horses, toward the saloon or wherever men went after these arrangements concluded. 2 of them were already riding away. The schoolteacher was talking animatedly with the man who'd taken off his hat. Harriet had walked off with the shorter man toward a wagon. Even the younger women were being led away by their respective choices. The platform was almost clear. I see that, Evelyn said. Clara said nothing else. That was the thing about Clara. She never pushed. She stated the facts and then she waited, because she trusted her mother to do something with facts even when there was nothing obvious to do. Evelyn shifted Peter on her shoulder. He stirred a little, whimpered, went back to sleep. She looked at the northwest sky again, maybe 20 minutes before it hit, if that, maybe less. And then she heard it. She almost missed it under the wind, a sound that didn't fit, coming from the east side of town rather than the west. Hooves. More than 2 horses moving fast, which was strange because the wind was already stiffening and any sensible rider would be pulling up rather than pushing through it. The sound grew. A few of the townspeople still lingering on the far end of the platform turned to look. A horse emerged at the end of the main street. A big dark animal, head down against the wind, moving with the urgent rhythm of something that had been running hard. Behind it came 2 more. The rider on the first horse was bundled against the weather, hat pulled low, coat collar up, but sitting forward in the saddle the way people rode when they had somewhere to be and were already past caring about the conditions. He pulled up at the platform end. The horse blew steam. The rider took a moment, just a moment, and then dismounted with the economical movement of someone for whom horses were not a novelty. He wasn't young, 40, maybe, or close to it. Tall, solidly built without being heavy. He handed the reins to one of the 2 men who'd ridden in with him, younger men, probably ranch hands, and looked at the platform. His gaze went to the near-empty south side, then to the near-empty north side, then to Evelyn. He started walking. She watched him come. There was something in the way he moved that was different from the other men who'd crossed to her side, the 3 who'd left, and the 1 who'd almost come. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't calculating. He was just walking toward her the way a man walked somewhere he'd decided to go. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her, then past her at the children, then back at her. Deputy Elkins said the arrangement was at noon, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Not harsh, just used, like wood that had been sanded down by weather rather than by tools. It was, she said. I'm late. You are. He looked past her again. She didn't turn around, but she could feel the children behind her. Clara still and watchful, Wyatt radiating 15-year-old resistance, the twins momentarily stilled by the arrival of something unexpected, May clutching her rabbit, Daniel, Sophie, and Peter in their various states of exhaustion and curiosity. Are these all yours? He said. Yes, she said. She was so tired of that question, but she answered it the same way every time, because the answer was yes, and the answer had always been yes, and she wasn't going to hedge it. He nodded slowly. Not the way the first man had nodded, not the math that doesn't work out nod, more like a man absorbing information and filing it away. How many? He said. 9. Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it. It wasn't horror, and it wasn't pity, and it wasn't the particular kind of retreat she'd been watching all afternoon. It was something else. Something more internal, like a man checking an assumption he'd made and finding it needed adjusting. I'm Colton Mercer, he said. I own a ranch about 9 miles northeast of here, 1,200 acres. Evelyn Harper, she said. From Sioux Falls originally. How long have you been standing here? The question surprised her. Not the logistics of it, she could answer that, but the fact that he'd asked it at all. The other men had asked about her age, about her dead husbands, about her practical capabilities. Nobody had asked how long she'd been standing. Since noon, she said. He looked at the sky. That's a long time. It is. He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed between them. Behind her, she heard Daniel shuffle his feet and Wyatt make a sound that wasn't quite a word. The others didn't, he started. No, she said. Because of the children. Yes. She watched his face while he thought. She'd gotten good at reading men's faces over the years, not as a skill she'd cultivated, but as something you developed out of necessity when you'd been dependent on men's decisions for most of your adult life. She could usually see which way a face was going before the words came. This one she couldn't read. It wasn't blank. It was just occupied, turned inward in a way that kept the surface neutral. Mrs. Harper, he said finally, I came out here today to meet someone. I wasn't looking for a particular arrangement or a particular kind of woman. I needed... He stopped, started again. My ranch needs someone who knows how to run a household. That's what I told myself. But I've been running my own household for 11 years, and what I've learned is that what I actually need is someone who won't break when things get hard. Evelyn waited. 9 children in a Wyoming winter is hard, he said. I'm aware, she said. But you're still here. She looked at him. Where else would I go? He was quiet. Then something shifted in his expression. A fractional thing, a change in the eyes more than anything else. And he said, Can I talk to them? She hadn't expected that either. She turned and looked at her children. They were watching him. Even Wyatt was watching him, though Wyatt's expression was the flat, defended look he wore like armor whenever an adult male entered the picture. You can try, she said. He walked toward them. She stepped aside. He stopped in front of Clara first because Clara was at the front, and he looked at her without the condescending brightness that adults often used on children when they were trying to make a good impression. How old are you? He said. 17, Clara said. What's your name? Clara. What do you do on the ranch? Then he paused. Sorry, you haven't been on a ranch. In Sioux Falls, Clara said. I ran the house, cooked for the ranch hands when we still had them, did the books for Papa's store. A brief pause. The second Papa. You kept books? Somebody had to. He nodded, moved to Wyatt. This was the one Evelyn watched most carefully. You, Colton said. Not unkindly, just directly. Wyatt's jaw tightened. What? Wyatt, Evelyn said. What, sir? Wyatt said, in the particular tone of someone fulfilling the letter of a requirement without the spirit of it. Colton looked at him for a moment. He didn't seem bothered by the tone. How old? 15. You do any cattle work? Some. Some meaning what? Helped with fencing, some branding, moved cattle on horseback a few times. You any good? Wyatt looked at him. Yeah, he said. Then, after a beat, Sir. Colton moved on. He went down the line. The twins, who told him their names and ages and immediately tried to out-talk each other. May, who showed him a rabbit without being asked. Daniel, who explained unprompted about his boot. Sophie, who looked at Colton for a long moment and said nothing but did not look away. He crouched down to her level, which most adults didn't bother to do. Sophie? Evelyn said quietly. Sophie said nothing. Colton looked at her for a moment, not pushing. Then he said, That's all right, and stood. He came back to Evelyn. The snow was starting. Not blizzard yet, just the first tentative flakes, which was its own kind of warning. The twins are going to be a handful, he said. They are. The boy, Daniel, he needs a new boot. I know. Wyatt doesn't trust me. He doesn't trust anyone, she said. He comes by it honestly. Colton looked at her. There was something direct about the way he looked at her, not assessing exactly. More like he was actually trying to see her rather than see what he needed her to be. Mrs. Harper, he said, I'm going to be straight with you. Please do. I came out here today because I've been alone on that ranch for 11 years and it started to feel, I don't know, too quiet, wrong kind of quiet. He paused. I wasn't looking for 9 children. Most people aren't, she said, but I'm not sure I can say the right things to make you trust me, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend I've got this figured out, because I don't. He looked at the sky, then back at her. I've got a house that needs a woman who knows what she's doing, and apparently what I've got is a woman who can run a house, keep books, and handle cattle all at the same time. That's an accurate summary, she said. The children would have their own rooms. What rooms we've got? We'd have to sort out the arrangements. He stopped. I'm making this sound like a business arrangement. It is, she said. He looked at her. Is that what you want? What I want, she said, is for my children to have enough to eat and a roof that doesn't leak and a school within riding distance. What I want stopped mattering in any particular individual sense a long time ago. She looked at him steadily. If you're asking if I'm hoping for something romantic, the answer is I'm hoping for something real. Real is rarer than romantic in my experience. The snow was coming faster now. Down the platform, Elkins was pulling his coat collar up and looking at them with the expression of a man who wanted to go home. If you're making an offer, she said, I'll need a week. He blinked. A week? to see the ranch, to see how the children settle, to see if what you're like on a Tuesday morning when things go wrong is the same as what you're like right now. He was quiet for a moment. She couldn't tell if she'd surprised him or annoyed him. He had a face that kept things close. "You're not exactly in a position to be particular," he said. "Not cruel about it, just factual." "No," she said. "I'm not. But I've made 2 marriages without enough information, and I can't afford a third mistake. Not with 9 of them depending on it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but settled, like a man who'd been presented with a problem and had found the shape of it. "All right," he said. "A week. Thank you." "We'll need to move," he said, looking at the sky. "If we leave now, we can get to the ranch before it really comes in." She looked at her children. They were watching her. All of them. Even Sophie. Even Peter, who had woken up and was watching with the ancient, unreadable attention of very small children, as though they understood more than they could say. Clara's eyes were steady. Wyatt's jaw was still set, but there was something underneath it. Not hope, not exactly, but the held breath quality of someone who hadn't yet decided to stop watching. May hugged her rabbit. Thomas had stopped elbowing George. Daniel forgot about his boot. The snow was falling in earnest now, coming sideways with the wind behind it, and the platform was nearly empty, and it was getting dark in the northwest the way it got dark when the sky meant business. Evelyn shifted Peter on her hip and looked at Colton Mercer. "Lead the way," she said. He nodded, turned toward his horses. And Evelyn Harper, who had been rejected 6 times that afternoon on a frozen platform in Wyoming, gathered her 9 children into the teeth of an incoming blizzard and walked forward into whatever came next. She didn't look back at the platform. She'd learned, a long time ago, that looking back at the thing you were leaving didn't do anything except make your neck hurt. The ride to Mercer Ranch took the better part of an hour, and it was not a comfortable hour. Colton had 2 wagons, one that had come with his ranch hands, a broad-bedded supply wagon with a canvas cover that did most of what a canvas cover was supposed to do in a blizzard, which was not enough, and his own horse, which he rode alongside rather than climbing into the wagon with the family, because there were practical reasons for that, and probably other reasons too that Evelyn didn't spend time thinking about. She had enough to think about. Peter had started crying about 10 minutes into the ride and didn't stop for 20. Thomas had elbowed George 1 too many times, and George had finally retaliated. And in the darkness of the wagon bed under the canvas, it had taken Evelyn 3 full minutes to locate who was hitting who and separate them by feel alone. Wyatt sat at the back with his arms crossed and said nothing to anyone. Clara held Iris and May on either side of her and sang something low and tuneless under her breath, which was what Clara did when she was managing her own nerves. Daniel had fallen asleep against a sack of grain before they'd left the town limits. Sophie sat beside him with her hand resting near his, not quite touching. The ranch hand driving the wagon, a weathered man named Hobb who'd introduced himself with 1 word and offered nothing further, seemed unbothered by the noise behind him. He drove with the steady patience of someone who'd been through worse and expected to be again. The blizzard came in full about halfway through the ride. Not gradual. It arrived the way Wyoming weather arrived, which was all at once and without apology. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like 5 minutes. The canvas over the wagon bed bellied and snapped. Peter, who had finally quieted, started up again. Evelyn pressed him against her chest and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. When the ranch finally appeared through the snow, first as a shape, then as lights, then as a collection of dark buildings arranged with the practical, unbeautiful logic of working land, she felt something she didn't quite have a word for. Not relief exactly, more like the moment before relief, when you could see that a thing was possible but hadn't yet let yourself believe it. Colton was off his horse before the wagon stopped. He came around to the back and pulled the canvas aside and looked in at all of them. "We're here," he said. "Main house is straight ahead. Hobb will get the horses." He helped Clara down first, then held his arms up for Peter without being asked. Evelyn watched him take the child, the way he held him, not awkward, but not practiced either, somewhere in between, and didn't say anything about it. The main house was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand. It wasn't the house of a man who spent money on appearances, but substantial. 2 stories, solid log and timber construction, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front and a chimney putting out wood smoke that smelled, in that moment, like the best thing she'd encountered in recent memory. Inside, someone had already been in to bank the fire. Hob, she assumed, or some arrangement Colton had made before leaving. The main room was warm, not hot. Warm. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. A large stone fireplace on the east wall. A long table, scarred and solid, with 8 chairs around it. Not enough for all of them, she noted automatically, filed it away. Shelves of supplies along the far wall. A staircase, narrow, leading up. 2 lanterns burning. The children crowded in behind her. She heard May say something quiet to her rabbit. She heard Thomas say, "It's big," and George say, "It's not that big." And Thomas say, "It's bigger than the place in Cheyenne," which was true and not a high bar, but she let them have it. Wyatt walked in last and stood with his back to the wall, the way he always positioned himself in new spaces, and looked at everything without expression. Colton came in behind them, stomping snow off his boots on the porch before entering. He looked at the room through their eyes for a moment. She could see him doing it, adjusting to the sudden fact of 11 people in a space that had held for 11 years only himself. "Kitchen's through there," he said, pointing. "There's food. I can—" He stopped. "I don't know what the children like." "They like anything that isn't salt pork," Clara said. "Clara," Evelyn said. "It's true, Mama." Colton almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his mouth, but it got close. "I've got venison stew from yesterday. Cornbread. There's milk if the youngest needs it." "Peter's been weaned," Evelyn said, "but he'll drink milk if it's warm." She fed them at the long table, Clara helping, the 2 of them working in the kitchen with the efficient shorthand of people who'd cooked together for years. Colton stayed out of the way, which was the right instinct. He sat at the far end of the main room with a cup of coffee and did something with a piece of leather harness that needed mending, which was also the right instinct, giving them space to settle without disappearing entirely. She watched him from the kitchen doorway while the stew heated. He wasn't performing. That was the thing she noticed. Most men, when they were trying to make an impression, performed it. The helpfulness was slightly too obvious, or the patience was slightly too deliberate. Colton just sat there mending harness and drinking his coffee, and occasionally glancing at the children with the assessing but non-intrusive attention of someone trying to learn names without making a project of it. Dinner was noisy. Meals with 9 children were always noisy, and this one had the added layer of strangeness. New space, new man at the end of the table, new smells and sounds. Peter kept turning around to stare at Colton. May introduced her rabbit, whose name was Bess, to the general table, and Thomas said rabbits weren't people and didn't belong at the table, and May said Bess had better manners than Thomas, which Evelyn privately thought was accurate. Wyatt didn't talk. He ate. More than he usually ate, which told her he'd been hungry, which told her she'd been cutting portions without fully realizing it, and kept his eyes on his bowl and then on the wall, and then, once, briefly, on Colton. Colton caught it. He didn't make anything of it. He just held Wyatt's gaze for a second and then looked back at his own bowl, and Wyatt looked away. After dinner, she put the younger ones to bed. Colton showed her the upstairs rooms, 3 of them, plus his own, which he offered without elaboration and which she declined without elaboration. They settled the children 2 and 3 to a room on improvised arrangements of bedrolls and folded blankets and the actual beds, which she noted needed new ticking but were otherwise sound. Peter went down between May and Iris. Sophie curled beside Daniel. The twins took one look at a room with a single bed and commenced negotiations that Evelyn shut down by telling them they'd sleep head to toe, and anyone who started a fight in the night would sleep in the barn. Thomas considered this. Would the barn be warmer or colder? "Colder," she said. "Okay," he said. Clara took the small room at the end of the hall, because Clara needed a space of her own more than any of them. She carried too much to share sleeping space without it costing her. Evelyn told her this, and Clara looked at her in the way she sometimes did, the way that was older than 17 should allow, and said, "I'm all right, Mama," which they both knew was not entirely true, and which they both also knew was not a conversation for tonight. Wyatt wasn't upstairs. She found him on the covered porch, sitting on the railing with his back against the post, looking out at the snow. The blizzard had settled into a steady, serious snowfall. Not the violent gusts of an hour ago, just the thick, determined kind that planned to be there a while. She stood beside him, didn't say anything, With Wyatt, silence was usually better than the alternative. He'd built walls that words bounced off of, but he didn't always leave when you stood next to him in quiet, which she'd learned was its own kind of door staying open. After a minute, he said, "How long we here for?" "I don't know yet," she said. "You said a week." "A week to decide. If it goes well, longer." He was quiet. Then, "And if it doesn't go well, then we figure out something else." "With what money?" She didn't answer that because she didn't have an answer that would help. Wyatt was 15 and he knew the numbers. He'd always known the numbers. It was one of the things that made him useful, and one of the things that had aged him in ways she sometimes struggled to look at directly. "He seems all right," Wyatt said, in the particular tone of someone making a reluctant concession. "He seems like something," she agreed carefully. "Papa seemed all right, too." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the snow. "Which one?" she said. "Both of them," he said. And then they were gone. She didn't try to fix that. She couldn't fix that. It was true. Both of his fathers had seemed all right, and both of them had died. And the fact of that had calcified inside Wyatt into something she couldn't reach with reassurance, because reassurance was just words, and words hadn't built anything strong enough to hold against what he'd already been through. "I know," she said. He pulled his coat tighter. I'm not gonna do the thing where I pretend he's my dad. Nobody's asking you to. People always ask you to. They just don't say it out loud." She thought about that. "You're right," she said. "I'll tell him not to." Wyatt looked at her then, a quick sideways look with something uncertain in it. "You'd tell him that?" "If it matters to you." He looked back at the snow. "It matters," he said, quietly enough that she almost didn't hear it. She went back inside. Colton was at the table with the harness still, though he'd moved on to something else. A ledger book open in front of him, a pencil working down a column of numbers. He looked up when she came in. "All of them down?" he said. "Except Wyatt. He's on the porch. He'll come in when he's ready." She sat down across from him. The fire had settled into the low, steady burn of a fire that would last the night. "I want to ask you something." "All right?" "Wyatt," she said. "He's 15. He's lost 2 fathers. He doesn't—" She stopped, tried again. "He doesn't want anyone to pretend. He doesn't want to be managed. He wants to know where he stands, and he needs you to let him figure that out himself rather than trying to speed it up." Colton set his pencil down. He was looking at her with the focused attention she'd noticed earlier, the kind that meant he was actually listening rather than waiting for her to stop talking. "He said that?" Colton asked. "Not in those words." "What words did he use?" She thought about it. "He said he wasn't going to pretend you were his dad." Colton nodded slowly. He looked at the ledger for a moment, not reading it, just giving himself somewhere to look while he thought. "That's fair," he said. "He needs to hear that from you." "I'll tell him." "Not tonight," she said. "He's not ready for it tonight. He needs to sit with it for a while first." Colton looked at her. "You know him very well." "He's my son. He's angry. He's earned it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He's 15 years old, and he's lost every man who was supposed to stay. He's got every right to be angry. The anger isn't the problem. The anger's what's been holding him together." She paused. "The problem is if it's still there in 10 years because nobody gave him a reason to put it down." Colton was quiet for a long time. Outside, the snow continued. The fire shifted and settled. "I'm not going to make promises I can't keep," he said finally. "I'll tell you that up front. I won't stand in front of that boy and tell him I'm going to be here forever because the truth is, I don't know what forever looks like, and I don't trust men who talk about forever like they understand it." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "That's not usually the response I'd expect to that." "I'm tired of men who talk about forever," she said. "I want a man who shows up on Tuesdays." Something passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. He picked up his pencil again, tapped it against the ledger. "You want to see the ranch tomorrow? Assuming the snow lets up enough." "Yes." "Clara can keep an eye on the younger ones?" "Clara can keep an eye on anything." He nodded. "There's a spare room, ground floor, off the kitchen. It's small, but it's separate. You can have that." "Thank you." She stood. She was more tired than she'd understood. The kind of tired that descended all at once when you finally stopped moving, When the sheer forward motion that had been holding you upright gave way, and you felt the actual weight of the day in your legs, in your back, and somewhere behind your eyes. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She turned. "The children," he said. "All 9 of them. They're—" He stopped, started differently. "When I rode in and saw you on that platform, still standing there after everyone else had left," he looked at the fire. "I almost didn't come. The weather was bad and I was late, and I told myself it was probably done for the day." She waited. "I'm glad I came," he said, simply, without ornament. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said goodnight and went to her room. The next morning came gray and bright with new snow, 6 inches of it, maybe more. And Colton was already up when she came into the kitchen, which she'd expected. Ranch people rose early. It wasn't a choice so much as a biological fact of the life. He'd made coffee and put oats on the stove, and he didn't make a fuss about having done it, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. The children descended in stages. Clara first, then the twins, who immediately began lobbying for outdoor privileges that Evelyn denied on the grounds that they'd be chest-deep in the drifts. Daniel came down with his left boot in his hand, looking at the crack in the sole with renewed morning concern. Colton looked at it, said he had a cobbler's awl and some leather in the workshop and they'd fix it later. And Daniel looked at him with the open, uncomplicated gratitude of an 8-year-old whose boot problem had just been solved by an adult with tools. Wyatt came down last, looked at Colton, looked at the oats, and sat down without comment. She watched Colton watch them all, and try not to look like he was watching them all. After breakfast, while Clara organized the younger ones into indoor activities with the competent authority of a small-scale general, Colton took Evelyn out to see the ranch. He lent her a coat that had belonged to someone. He didn't say who, and she didn't ask. Heavier than her own and slightly too large in the shoulders, but warm. They walked the property for 2 hours. He showed her the main barn, where 4 horses and 2 milk cows lived in the solid, well-kept way of animals belonging to a man who understood that livestock was investment, not sentiment. He showed her the smokehouse, nearly full, and the root cellar, well-stocked. He showed her the bunkhouse, where Hob and 2 other hands lived, Kate and Wren. She'd meet them properly at supper. And the workshop, where he kept tools and equipment in the organized chaos of a man who knew where everything was and couldn't explain the system to anyone else. He walked her to the fence lines to the north and east, which took a while in the snow. He talked as they walked. Not to fill silence, but practically, explaining things she'd need to know. Water source was the creek to the east. It froze over in hard winters, but they kept it cut. Cattle wintered on the south pasture with supplemental feed from the stores. The garden plot, empty now, was on the sheltered west side of the house and ran about 40 by 60 feet. Which was a good size if she wanted it. "If I want it," she said. "It's there," he said. "What you do with it's your business." She looked at him. The light was better today than yesterday, clear and cold and sharp in the way of winter mornings after fresh snow, and she could see him more fully than she had on the platform. There were lines around his eyes that came from squinting into weather, and a scar along his jaw that angled down toward his chin, at the particular angle of something that had happened fast. His hands were large and consistently occupied. He'd pick something up and set it down, or check a latch, or adjust something on a fence post, not from nervousness, but from the habit of a man who worked with his hands and found stillness uncomfortable. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. "On this ranch 11 years. In the territory 14. "Alone the whole time?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not the whole time," he said, and didn't elaborate, and she didn't push it. Everyone had a geography of their own losses. She'd told him about her 2 husbands because it was relevant. She didn't need his full accounting today. "You know what you're taking on," she said, "with 9 of them. I need to know you actually know." He stopped walking, turned to face her. They were standing at the east fence line, the ranch buildings visible behind them through the cold air. "No," he said honestly. "I don't know. I've never done it. I can't tell you I've thought through every part of it because I haven't. What I can tell you is that I'm not a man who starts things he means to leave." She looked at him. The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind her a crow made noise in a bare cottonwood tree. "That's a more useful answer than most," she said. They went back to the house. Over the following days, the week acquired its own particular rhythm, different from anything she'd had before. The children spread into the ranch the way children spread into any new space, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. Thomas and George had discovered the barn on day 2 and now spent every free moment there, which kept them occupied and out of each other's reach for stretches long enough that the bruising on George's left arm from the wagon bed incident had started to fade. May brought Bess to visit the milk cows, a social call that the cows received with bovine indifference. Daniel's boot was repaired on day 1 by Colton and Cade together, a project that Daniel observed with such focused attention that Cade had eventually handed him the awl and let him work a section himself. Sophie still didn't speak, but she followed Colton sometimes, at a distance, the way a stray animal followed someone they weren't sure of yet, and watched him work. He didn't try to engage her, he just worked and let her watch, and occasionally narrated what he was doing the way you'd talk to yourself, not performing it for her, but not pretending she wasn't there either. Wyatt worked. That was the most direct thing she could say about it. On day 3, Wyatt had come out to the barn in the morning and asked Hob if there was something useful he could do, and Hob, without ceremony, had put him to work. She'd seen them in the afternoon, working alongside each other on some fence repair that the blizzard had required, and Wyatt had looked, not happy, because Wyatt didn't do happy as an outward expression, but occupied in a way that was different from the restless, defended occupation of his usual state. More like a current that had found a channel. Colton spoke to Wyatt on day 4. She didn't witness the conversation. She was inside when it happened, helping Clara reorganize the kitchen to make better sense for their numbers. But she heard about it from Clara, who had seen it from the window. "They were out by the fence," Clara said, not looking up from the shelf she was rearranging. Mr. Mercer said something, and Wyatt said something back, and then they worked for about an hour next to each other without talking. "Did Wyatt look angry afterward?" Evelyn asked. Clara considered. "He looked like himself," she said, "but less of it." Evelyn thought that was probably the best possible outcome. On day 5, she sat with Colton after the children were in bed. It had become a habit. She hadn't planned it, but the house settled after the last child went up the stairs, and she and Colton both found themselves at the table in the hour before sleep, him with coffee or ledgers or mending, her with whatever needed doing, and they talked. Not about large things, mostly. Not about the decision still sitting between them like an object neither had picked up yet. They talked about the ranch, and about the children, and once about Sioux Falls, and once about what the spring looked like in this part of the territory, which he described with an unexpected specificity that told her he looked at the land and actually saw it rather than just working it. "I need to ask you something," she said on day 5, after a long quiet that had been comfortable rather than awkward. "Ask. Why me?" She looked at him across the table. On that platform. There were other women, younger, without 9 mouths to feed. Why did you walk to my side? He was quiet for a long time. The fire was low. The house was the particular quiet of a house full of sleeping children, which was different from any other kind of quiet. Denser, somehow, more inhabited. "The other women were waiting," he said finally, "and you were—" He stopped. "You weren't waiting. You were just standing, like you'd already decided the outcome wasn't up to anyone else." She looked at him. "I've been out here 14 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of people come to this territory and not last. The ones who don't last are the ones who can only function when things go right. The ones who stay are the ones who've already made peace with things going wrong." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I don't need someone who functions when things are easy. I need someone who doesn't collapse when they're hard." "That's not exactly flattering," she said. "It's not meant to be flattering," he said. "It's meant to be true." She sat with that for a moment, then, "The week's almost up." "I know. I've been watching you," she said. "With them." "I know that too." "You're not pretending," she said. "That's what I was looking for. Most people try too hard when they're being watched. You just do what you do anyway." He looked at her. "Is that enough?" She thought about 2 marriages and 9 children and $7.40 and a frozen platform in January. She thought about Clara's 2 old eyes and Wyatt's armored silence and Sophie's careful watching and Daniel's cracked boot and Peter's weight against her shoulder in the blizzard. She thought about standing on that platform after everyone else had gone, when the smart thing would have been to leave, and how she hadn't left because she couldn't afford to mistake pride for stubbornness, and she also couldn't afford to mistake exhaustion for knowing when to stop. "It might be," she said carefully. "I'm not going to tell you I'm certain. I don't think either of us should be certain yet." He nodded. "Fair, but I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think you're a man who means what he says, and I think the ranch is good land, and I think my children are already half settled here, whether I decide anything or not." She looked at the fire. "Wyatt asked me last night if there was a school within riding distance." Colton blinked. "There's one in town, 4 miles. He said the twins would need somewhere to put their energy that wasn't each other." The almost smile again. A little more of it this time, enough that she could actually see it. "That's true," he said. "Wyatt doesn't invest attention in things he's already written off," she said. "If he's asking about the school, he's not written this off yet." Colton was quiet. Then, carefully. Not the way a man spoke when he was trying to win, but the way a man spoke when he was actually uncertain and didn't want to cover it up. "And you? Have you written it off?" She looked at him. At the scar along his jaw and the hands around the coffee cup and the ledger open on the table and the house around them with its 9 sleeping children and its good stone fireplace and its kitchen she'd already started to reorganize in her head. "No," she said. "I haven't." He nodded once. He didn't push for more than that. She'd noticed he didn't push, like, for information or reassurance or any of the things that men in uncertain situations sometimes pushed for to manage their own discomfort. He let things be what they were and waited to see what they became. She respected that more than she'd expected to. "Then we'll see," he said. "We'll see," she agreed. She went to bed. She lay in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the house settle. The sounds of old timber and banked fires and the weight of wind against walls that were solid enough to hold against it. She lay there for a long time before sleep came, and when it did, she didn't dream about anything she could remember in the morning. But she slept through the night, all the way through. For the first time in a very long time, she slept through the whole night without waking. The decision, when it finally came, didn't arrive the way Evelyn had imagined it would. She'd thought there would be a formal moment, a morning when she sat across from Colton at the table and told him what she'd decided, and he told her what he was willing to offer, and they worked out the terms the way 2 people worked out any arrangement that would bind them together through seasons and difficulty and the long, ordinary, grinding passage of time. She'd imagined it would be deliberate, considered, the kind of thing you could point to afterward and say, that was the day it was settled. Instead, on the morning of the 7th day, she was in the kitchen making biscuits. She'd found the flour bin and the lard and the buttermilk without asking, which was either presumptuous or settled in, depending on how you looked at it. And Colton came in from the barn with ice in his beard and said, "Hob says the north fence line took damage in the last storm. I'm going to need another hand to work it properly." She looked at him. "Wyatt's been doing good work," he said. "If he's willing." She turned back to the biscuits. "Ask him," she said. "I will." A pause. Then, "Also, Cade's going to town on Thursday. If you need anything from the dry goods, you should make a list." "All right," she said. He went back out. She stood there with her hands in the biscuit dough and realized that what had just happened was that they had stopped speaking to each other like people in negotiation and started speaking to each other like people who shared a roof in a way that was going to continue. The decision had already been made somewhere in the days behind them. They'd just been waiting to notice it. She didn't say anything about it. She made the biscuits. February came in cold and stayed that way. The ranch settled into the rhythm of winter work, maintenance and supply and keeping the animals alive and keeping the pipes from freezing and the steady, unglamorous business of making a large property function through the season that tried hardest to stop it. Evelyn found her place in it the same way she'd found her place in every household she'd run, by watching how things worked and then figuring out where she was most needed, which wasn't always the obvious place. She kept the kitchen and organized the stores, which needed organizing after 11 years of a man living alone with no particular system. She took over the ledger from Colton, who handed it over without resistance and with what she suspected was actual relief, because his numbers were accurate, but his categories were a mess. She established a schooling schedule for the children who were old enough. Clara had been the teacher in Cheyenne too, another job she'd taken on without complaint, and she took it on here with the same competence. setting Daniel and May and Iris to letters and arithmetic each morning at the table while the older ones worked. The twins were enrolled at the school in town the third week of February. This required 2 horses, a cold 4-mile ride, and a conversation with the schoolmaster there, a lean, humorless man named Beecham, who looked at Thomas and George with the resigned expression of an educator who had met their type before. Colton rode them in the first day, and the second, and the third, until Wyatt said he'd do it, which was something nobody pushed him toward, and which meant more because of that. Wyatt had changed. Not suddenly, not completely. He was still 15, still defended, still slow to trust anything that hadn't proven itself over time. But Hob had taken to him in the silent, practical way that old ranch hands sometimes took to boys who worked hard and didn't complain. And Colton had been as good as his word about not pushing. He treated Wyatt the way he'd treat any competent hand who'd shown up to work, with direct instruction, fair expectations, and the particular respect of taking someone seriously rather than managing them. Wyatt had noticed. He didn't say he'd noticed because he was Wyatt, but Evelyn watched the change in how he held himself in Colton's presence, the slight loosening of the jaw and shoulders that in another boy might look like relaxation, and in Wyatt meant only that he'd lowered the first of several walls. Sophie remained the one Evelyn couldn't quite reach. She'd been quiet since the death of Robert, Evelyn's second husband, 18 months ago, which had followed a period of upheaval that had been too long and too loud for a 4-year-old to make sense of. Sophie had stopped talking the way some children stopped eating when things went wrong, as a response to a world that had become too unpredictable to engage with on its own terms. The doctor in Cheyenne had told Evelyn she'd likely come back to speech on her own time. The doctor had also suggested it might take longer than felt comfortable, and that the best thing was to not make it a crisis, because children could smell when something they were doing was being treated as a crisis, and it tended to make things worse. So Evelyn hadn't made it a crisis. She'd spoken to Sophie normally, included her in conversation as if she'd responded, left space for her in every room without making the space obvious. Sophie had her own language. She communicated in touches and positioning and the particular quality of her attention, which was so acute that Evelyn sometimes felt seen more clearly by her silent 5-year-old than by anyone who had words at their disposal. Colton had understood this without being told. Evelyn didn't know how, but he had. He never pushed Sophie to speak, never made the forced, cheerful adult attempts to draw her out that well-meaning people sometimes made with silent children. He just let her be near him when she chose to be and narrated his work and occasionally left things where she could see them. Once, a small piece of wood he'd been carving, set on the edge of the workbench at a height a child could reach, and said nothing about any of it. Sophie had taken the carving. It was rough, the shape of a horse, or close to one, the legs slightly uneven and the neck too thick. She carried it with her everywhere, the same way May carried Bess. It was a Wednesday night in the third week of February when Peter got sick. It started the way these things always started, slowly enough that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't starting at all. He was fussy at dinner, which was not unusual for a 2-year-old, and he didn't want to be put down, which was also not unusual. Evelyn settled him against her while she ate, felt the warmth of him that was slightly more than warmth, and told herself he was probably just overtired. The winter had been hard on the younger children. Disrupted sleep, not enough outdoor air, the low-grade restlessness of little bodies kept mostly inside. She put him to bed between May and Iris, the way she always did, checked him twice before she went to sleep herself, and told herself he'd be better in the morning. He was not better in the morning. By morning, the fever had taken hold properly, and Peter had the glazed, frightened look of a very small child who doesn't understand why his body has turned against him. He was burning up when she lifted him. That particular heat that was beyond normal, beyond the warmth of sleep, that specific terrifying temperature that every mother recognized and none of them ever got used to. "Mama!" That was Iris, 6 years old, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with her hands twisted together. "Peter's making a noise." "I know," Evelyn said. "Go get Clara." Clara came immediately, took one look at Peter, and said nothing for 3 seconds while she assessed. Then, "How high do you think?" "High," Evelyn said. Because it was. "What do we do?" "Cool cloths first. Get the water cold from the pump, not the warmed kettle, and keep the others out of this room." Clara moved. Evelyn held Peter against her chest and felt him shaking, which was the fever working, which she knew intellectually and which did nothing to loosen the hard knot of fear that had installed itself under her sternum the moment she'd felt his temperature. She'd lost a child before. Not one of these 9. Another, a boy who'd come between Wyatt and Clara, before either of the later husbands, a boy who'd been born early and small and had lived for 11 days and then hadn't. She'd never spoken about him to anyone, including Clara, because there was no language she'd found that was adequate to the thing, and because she'd built something around that loss over the years, not over it, not past it, but around it, a structure that let her function. And she was careful about the things that threatened to dismantle it. Peter's fever demolished the structure without effort. She sat with him through the morning. Clara did the cold compresses. Evelyn kept him as still as she could, which was difficult because sick children didn't want to be still, and she talked to him. Not about anything in particular, just the low, continuous reassurance of a voice he'd been hearing since before he was born. Colton came in from the barn at mid-morning and found them in the main room, Peter on Evelyn's lap with a wet cloth on his forehead. Colton went still in the doorway for a moment. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Could be a bad cold. Could be something more." She looked at him. "He needs a doctor if it goes worse." "Nearest doctor's in Caldwell Creek," Colton said. He was already thinking through it. She could see it in his face, the practical calculation of distance and weather and what was available. "Roads are passable this morning. If the wind picks up this afternoon. If it gets worse, you go for the doctor," she said. "Understood." It got worse by noon. Peter's breathing changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A roughness beneath it, a catch that wasn't there in the morning, and his color was wrong. And when he cried, it was the weak, confused crying of a child who didn't have the energy to cry properly, which was somehow more frightening than loud distress. She'd heard that sound before. Not with any of these children, but in her childhood, from a neighbor boy. She knew what it meant, and she knew she had maybe hours to work with before knowing wasn't enough. "Colton," she said. He was already putting his coat on. She watched him go out the door and listened to him calling for Hob, and then listened to the sounds of fast preparation in the barn. Horses moved quickly, the specific efficiency of men who understood that speed had a practical purpose and not a moment of it should be wasted. Through the front window she watched him ride out, head down against the wind that had in fact picked up, the dark shape of him and the horse moving fast toward the road to town until the snow swallowed them. The afternoon was the longest she remembered in recent years. She and Clara worked steadily and without drama, because the situation demanded steadiness, and Clara was 17 years old and made of the same material her mother was made of, even if it had been formed under different conditions. They alternated the cool compresses. They kept the room at the right temperature, warm enough for Peter, but not so warm it fed the fever. They took turns so neither of them had to stop moving long enough to think too carefully about what they were waiting for. The rest of the children knew something was wrong. Children always knew. May kept Bess pressed to the doorway of the main room, not coming in, but not going away. The twins were uncharacteristically still. Thomas had found something in the workshop to occupy his hands, and George had stationed himself near the window that faced the road, which was where he stayed. Daniel sat at the table with his school lessons open in front of him and didn't look at them. Iris stayed in the kitchen because the kitchen was adjacent to the main room and she could hear from there. Wyatt came in from outside sometime in the early afternoon, still in his work coat, and stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at Peter. "Is he started. "He's still fighting," Clara said, because Clara understood that what Wyatt was asking was not a question with a simple answer, and this was the honest version of what they knew. Wyatt stood there for a moment. He looked. She would think about it later, the way he looked in that moment, like someone much younger than 15, like the version of him that existed before the walls went up, that she sometimes caught glimpses of and then lost again. He went back outside. She didn't call after him. An hour passed. Then another. Peter's fever didn't break, but it didn't climb further, which was something. She held him and talked to him and watched his breathing and held herself very steady, which was a thing she'd gotten good at over the years. The inside of her could be doing anything at all, and the outside could be still. It was a useful skill. It was also exhausting in a way that only revealed itself afterward, when the steadiness wasn't needed anymore, and the cost of it came due all at once. Sophie came in quietly, which was how Sophie went everywhere. She stood beside Evelyn's chair and looked at Peter for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her small hand on Peter's foot. Not the sick parts of him, not his forehead or his chest, just his foot, which was wrapped in a small wool sock that had a hole in the toe that Evelyn had been meaning to darn. Sophie held his foot and looked at his face. Evelyn watched her. Sophie looked up at her mother. Their eyes met. And then Sophie, her quiet one, her watcher, her child who had not spoken a word in 18 months, opened her mouth. "He's going to be all right," Sophie said. The words came out rough from disuse, a little flattened the way a voice sounded when it hadn't been used in a long time. But they were clear. They were complete. They were a sentence. Evelyn didn't move. She was afraid that if she moved, something would break. The moment, or something in herself that was currently holding by a narrow margin. "Yes," she said carefully. "He is." Sophie looked back at Peter. She kept her hand on his foot. Clara had gone very still at the other side of the room. Evelyn didn't look at her. She looked at Sophie, and she thought about all the things she'd decided not to make a crisis out of over the past 18 months, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she'd made the right call about something. She didn't push for more. She let Sophie hold Peter's foot, and she held the rest of him, and the afternoon continued. Colton came back with the doctor at dusk. She heard the horses before she saw them, the sound of them pulling up fast outside, and then boots on the porch, and then the door. And then Colton came in with a compact, gray-haired man behind him, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this long enough that nothing surprised him badly anymore. "Dr. Emmett Ferris," the man said, already shrugging off his coat. "Which one?" "Here," Evelyn said. He examined Peter with the brisk, competent attention of a man who knew what he was looking for and knew how to find it without ceremony. He checked the temperature, listened to the chest, checked the throat and the eyes and the color of the lips, and asked Evelyn a series of direct questions about the progression that she answered directly, because she was not the kind of woman who talked around medical information when a child's health was at stake. "Pneumonia," he said finally. He said it without softening it, which she was grateful for. "Early stage. You caught it early, which is the only reason I'm speaking to you in a normal tone of voice right now." He looked at her. "You know what to do for this?" "I know the basics," she said. "I'll write it out," he said. "Steam, fluids, keep him warm but not hot. Willow bark tincture for the fever. I've got some with me. He needs someone with him through the night." "I'll be with him," she said. "And you need to sleep at some point." "I'll sleep when he's better." Ferris looked at her for a moment with the evaluating look of someone assessing whether an argument was worth having. He apparently decided it wasn't. "I'll come back day after tomorrow," he said. "If he's worse before then, send someone." "Thank you," she said. He spoke with Colton briefly near the door. She caught parts of it, practical matters of what to watch for, when to worry more than this. And then he was back on his horse and gone, because doctors in this territory covered a lot of ground, and there were always more people who needed them. Colton closed the door and turned around. He looked at Evelyn holding Peter, at the bowl of water and the cloths, at Clara sitting in the chair across the room. "What do you need?" he said. She thought about it. "More wood on the fire. The kettle on. I'll need hot water through the night for the steam." She paused. "And if the twins aren't asleep, tell them they need to be." He nodded. He went to the fire and put wood on it. He got the kettle going. She heard him on the stairs, the boards that creaked in the specific pattern she'd already memorized, and then the low sound of his voice above her, telling Thomas and George something she couldn't hear, and the settling quiet that followed. He came back down and sat in the chair beside her. She looked at him. "You don't need to stay up," she said. "I know," he said. He picked up a piece of mending from the basket near the hearth. She'd started the basket, imported the habit from every other house she'd run, and worked at it in the firelight. She didn't tell him again to go to sleep. She was too tired to argue, and, if she was honest, she didn't actually want him to go. The night was long. Peter woke twice with crying that was still the weak, confused kind, and she soothed him and adjusted the steam and gave him the tincture in small doses with a little water, and held him until he slept again. Colton dozed in the chair across from her and woke each time Peter cried and looked over, and when she didn't need anything went back to the chair, which was exactly the right behavior, and she noted it without comment. Wyatt appeared at 2 in the morning. She looked up, and he was standing at the bottom of the stairs in his socks, hair everywhere. "Can't sleep," he said. "Come sit down," she said. He sat on the bench by the fire, close enough to see Peter, but not close enough to crowd. He looked at his brother, because Peter was his brother, in the particular way that Wyatt did or didn't acknowledge things, which was not always verbally, but was always real. "Sophie talked," he said, after a while. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a house full of children. She should have known. "She did," Evelyn said. "What did she say?" "She said Peter was going to be all right." Wyatt looked at Peter, looked at the fire. "Is she right?" "I think so," Evelyn said. "I hope so. I'm working on it." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Sophie stopped talking when Papa died. The second Papa." "I know. She used to talk all the time before." He said it with the faraway quality of someone remembering a version of things that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "She used to follow me around and ask me things." "She still follows you around," Evelyn said. He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. "Yeah," he said, quietly. He stayed for another hour. He fell asleep on the bench, which was not the most comfortable place to fall asleep, but he was 15, and 15 could sleep on stone if it was tired enough. She covered him with the blanket from the back of the chair and let him be. Colton, who had been awake, watched her do it. She looked at him across the room. He said nothing. Neither did she. But something passed between them in the firelight. Not sentiment exactly, not the romantic kind of thing that the word sentiment implied. Something more like recognition. Like two people who had both been in situations that required them to function beyond what felt manageable, recognizing that quality in each other. She turned back to Peter. By morning, the fever had broken. Not entirely. He was still warm, still tired, still needing the tincture and the steam and the careful management that Ferris had outlined. But the terrifying peak of it had passed, and when Peter woke at dawn and looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in 24 hours, she felt the structure she'd built around the losses in her life absorb this particular threat and hold. Just barely, but hold. "Mama," Peter said. His voice was hoarse. "I'm here," she said. "Thirsty." She gave him water. He drank it and then put his head back down on her shoulder and went to sleep again. And she sat there in the thin gray morning light with her 2-year-old asleep against her and Wyatt still on the bench and Colton in the chair across from her, awake now, watching the fire. She heard the house begin to wake above her. The particular pattern of it, Clara first, always, and then the sound of her waking the younger ones in her organized, unfussy way. Feet on the ceiling, then on the stairs. Clara appeared first, as expected, and looked at Evelyn and then at Peter. "He broke the fever," Evelyn said. Clara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "I'll put the oats on," she said, and went to the kitchen. May appeared next, Bess in hand, and looked at Peter with enormous brown eyes, and Evelyn said, "He's better, sweetheart." And May said, "I told Bess he would be," in the entirely factual tone of a 9-year-old who believed this completely. George came and looked, said nothing, went to wake Thomas, because George was the one who processed things externally after the fact, and the way he'd process this was by finding Thomas and telling him about it in some form. Daniel came and stood beside the chair and put his hand briefly on Peter's head, a gesture so adult in its quiet care that it made something catch in Evelyn's chest. Iris came and immediately wanted to help with something, which was what Iris did in any situation, helpful being her primary mode of emotional processing. Sophie came last. She came to Evelyn's chair and looked at Peter, and Peter, who had half woken again, looked back at her. "Hi, Peter," Sophie said. Still that roughed-up, recently recovered voice, still clear. Peter looked at her with the guileless attention of a very small child. "Hi, Sophie," he said, with the 2-year-old's version of her name. Sophie stood there for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor beside the chair, her back against the side of it, the carved wooden horse in her hand, and she stayed there while the house came alive around them. Colton got up from his chair and went to help Clara with breakfast. Wyatt woke on the bench, looked around with the disoriented expression of someone unsure how they'd arrived where they were, and then looked at Peter and the disorientation settled into something more focused. "He looks better," Wyatt said. "He is better," Evelyn said. Wyatt stood up, stretched in the way of someone who'd slept badly and knew it. He looked at Colton, who had come back from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, and set one on the table near Evelyn without asking if she wanted it. "I can ride for the doctor," Wyatt said to Colton, "if he needs checking before Ferris was coming back." Colton looked at him. "You know the road to town?" "Rode it twice this week." "There's going to be ice on the East Bend." "I know about the ice," Wyatt said. "I'm the one told you about it." Colton held his gaze for a second. "Fair enough," he said. Wyatt went to get his boots and coat. Evelyn watched this exchange without participating in it, and she noted what it was. 2 people who had established, without ceremony or announcement, a working language between them. Not father and son. Not anything with a clean name. Just 2 people who had figured out how to occupy the same space without either of them losing something essential. She picked up the coffee. It was hot, and not particularly good. Colton made functional coffee, not inspired coffee, which was the kind of thing you only noticed once the immediate crisis had passed and your mind had room for small observations again. She noticed it now, and the fact that she noticed it felt like a sign of something. Like the part of her that processed ordinary details had come back online after being offline for the duration. Peter shifted against her and sighed in his sleep. Outside, the wind had settled and the sky had the particular white stillness of a cold day that had decided to be calm. And through the window she could see the ranch in the morning light, the barn and the fence lines and the long slope of the south pasture and the cottonwoods along the creek that still held their snow from the last storm, each branch outlined in white. She'd seen a lot of mornings in a lot of places. She'd seen them in Sioux Falls and in the 2 houses before that, and in the rented rooms in Cheyenne, and on the train coming west, and on the frozen platform where this particular chapter had started. She had a category in her mind for mornings after. The specific, depleted, undecorated feeling of having gotten through something you weren't entirely sure you'd get through. This one was that. It was also something else, which she didn't try to name because she wasn't certain she had a name for it yet, and she'd learned not to put words to things before the words were ready. She drank her coffee. She held her son. Sophie sat on the floor beside her chair. The house smelled like oats and wood smoke and the willow bark tincture, and Claire was saying something to Iris in the kitchen about the order of breakfast tasks. And somewhere upstairs, Thomas had apparently found something to argue about, because Thomas always found something, and the ranch outside the window was still and cold and impossibly bright. Peter recovered slowly, the way small children recovered from serious illness. Not in a straight line, but in the uneven, frustrating pattern of 2 good days followed by 1 bad one. A little more energy, and then a crash, appetite returning, and then vanishing again. Dr. Ferris came back as promised, declared the pneumonia retreating, and told Evelyn she'd managed it as well as he could have himself, which was the highest praise she suspected Ferris offered anyone. By the first week of March, Peter was sitting up on his own and eating properly, and had developed a new habit of following Colton around the main room in the mornings, which appeared to have started when Colton crouched down to pick something up off the floor, and Peter had decided this was an invitation. Colton had adapted to the shadow with the same practical acceptance he brought to most things. He didn't make a production of it, didn't perform affection for the watching family, just worked around a 2-year-old at his feet the way he worked around any obstacle that was a permanent feature of the landscape. The town found out about the Harpers before Evelyn was ready for the town to find out. She'd known it was coming. Caldwell Creek was not a large place, maybe 400 people, with the surrounding ranches and homesteads pushing that number to perhaps 600 if you counted generously, and 400 people constituted a community in the frontier sense of the word, which meant everyone's business was available to everyone else with a lag time of roughly 48 hours. Cade went to town for supplies. Hob went to town for the mail. The twins went to school. News traveled. The first indication came in early March when Colton went to town for a meeting at the land office and came back in the late afternoon with a particular stillness about him that she'd learned to read as something having happened that he was sorting through before speaking about. She waited until after dinner, until the children were occupied or going to bed, and then she poured 2 cups of coffee and put them on the table. Colton sat down. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment. "Harlan Duchamp spoke to me at the land office today," he said. She knew the name. Harlan Duchamp was one of 3 or 4 names that came up repeatedly when Caldwell Creek was discussed, a cattle baron of the old school. The kind of man who'd been in the territory long enough that he'd started to mistake longevity for entitlement. He ran the largest operation in the county, about 15,000 acres, and his wife was one of those women who organized the social architecture of a frontier town, the way military commanders organize supply lines, efficiently, strategically, and with a clear sense of who belonged where. "What did he say?" she asked. Colton turned his cup. "He said he'd heard I had a woman and children out at the ranch. He said he wanted to make sure I understood what I was getting into." A pause. "He said it in the way men say things when they're informing you of something you're supposed to already be embarrassed about." "What did you say?" "I told him I understood what I was getting into better than he did." She looked at him. "How did he take that?" "About as well as a man like that takes being told he doesn't know something." Colton drank his coffee. His wife's organizing a social, a dinner at the Duchamp house for the established ranching families of the county. He made a point of telling me about it in the way that made clear I wouldn't be receiving an invitation. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She understood the geometry of this. It wasn't new to her, not in its fundamentals. The shape of it changed depending on where you were and what the specific currency of belonging was, but the mechanism was the same everywhere. The people who had defined themselves as the center decided who was peripheral. The peripheral people were either absorbed over time through the right marriages and the right associations and the right kinds of worth, or they stayed peripheral until they left or stopped caring. She had never been particularly good at staying peripheral. "Tell me about the Duchamps," she said. He told her. Harlan had been in the territory for 22 years, had arrived with money from an Eastern inheritance, and had the advantage of knowing exactly how to spend it in a place where land was available and the rules were still being written. His wife, Vera, was from St. Louis, old money relative to the territory, though Evelyn doubted it was particularly old money by any other measure. They had 2 adult sons who ran portions of the operation and daughters who had married strategically into other established families. The Duchamps had been the largest ranching family in the county for 15 years, and they administered that fact the way royalty administered a title, with the assumption that precedence was its own argument. "Do they have any actual authority over anything?" Evelyn asked. "Not legally," Colton said. "But Harlan Duchamp is on the County Land Commission, and he's contributed significantly to the Railroad Survey Fund, and he's been personally acquainted with the territorial governor for about a decade. So no legal authority and considerable practical influence." "I see," she said. He looked at her. "This is going to be a problem," he said. Not dramatically, just as a fact that needed to be named. "It was always going to be a problem," she said. "People like the Duchamps don't become problems because of anything you do. They become problems because you exist in a way that inconveniences their understanding of how things should be arranged." Colton looked at her steadily. "You've dealt with this before." "I've dealt with versions of it," she said. "It was different in Sioux Falls, but the essential thing is the same." "What did you do in Sioux Falls?" She thought about it. "I did the work," she said, "and I didn't ask permission for anything I had a right to do. And when people made it unpleasant, I made sure the unpleasantness cost them more than it cost me." He almost smiled. "How'd that work out?" "About 50-50, she said honestly. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind was back. It was always back in Wyoming in March. A different wind from the February one, less violent but more persistent, the kind that wore at things over time. Through the walls, she could hear it working at the eaves. "Vera Duchamp's going to come calling," Colton said. "That's how it works here. She'll come before she's ready to accept you, so that when she talks about you afterward, she can say she made the effort. She'll be polite, and she'll be watching everything, and she'll leave, and then whatever she says next will determine how about half the women in this county treat you for the next 2 years." Evelyn put down her cup. "Then I'd better be ready for her." She was ready 3 days later, though ready was not precisely the word she would have chosen. She'd made sure the house was in order, not the performed order of a woman trying to impress, but the actual working order of a house that functioned, which she'd found was ultimately more persuasive to anyone worth persuading. The kitchen was clean and organized along principles she could defend. The children were warned to behave, which for the twins meant a negotiation that resulted in their spending the afternoon of Vera Duchamp's visit in the barn with Hob, which suited everyone. Vera arrived with her eldest daughter-in-law, a woman named Constance, who appeared to be about 30, and who had the practiced pleasantness of someone who'd spent a long time around a woman like Vera, and had learned to be useful in the particular way that a second instrument was useful in a performance that only needed one. Evelyn opened the door before they knocked, because she'd seen the carriage coming from the kitchen window. "Mrs. Duchamp," she said, "please come in." Vera Duchamp was about 55, handsome in the emphatic way of women who had always known they were handsome and had maintained it as a matter of principle. She wore good wool and good boots, and her hair was arranged with the precision of someone who had hired help for the purpose. She came into the house and looked at the main room with the specific survey of someone who was absorbing data while appearing to simply look around. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "how lovely that you've settled in." The word settled carried about 4 layers of meaning, none of them quite the surface one. Evelyn registered all 4 and let them pass. "Please sit down," she said. "Claire's made coffee and there's cake, nothing elaborate, but it's good." Clara was 17 and more composed under observation than most adults Evelyn knew. She poured coffee and presented the cake, a simple spiced apple cake that she made from memory, and then excused herself to the kitchen with the unforced grace of a girl who understood the room without having been briefed on its politics. Vera watched her go. "Your daughter?" she said. "My eldest, Clara." "She's poised," Vera said. The way she said it was ambiguous enough to be a compliment and conditional enough to be an assessment. "She is," Evelyn agreed, pleasantly and without elaboration. They talked for the better part of an hour. Vera asked about Sioux Falls. She had a way of asking questions that sounded like conversation, but functioned like intake forms, each answer quietly filed and cross-referenced with whatever she'd already assembled from other sources. Evelyn answered straightforwardly, which was her practice, because she'd found that people who were building a case against you worked much harder when you were evasive, and much less effectively when you gave them the plain truth, which was frequently less damaging than what they'd imagined. She told Vera about her 2 husbands. She told her about the general store and the debt. She told her about Cheyenne and the platform in Caldwell Creek. She told it all without apology or performance, in the same tone she might use to describe a route she'd taken to get somewhere. Vera listened. Constance listened. Peter appeared at one point from the back of the house, having escaped whatever supervision had been applied to him, and walked directly to the sitting area and looked at Vera with the fearless curiosity of a 2-year-old who had no context for social hierarchy. Vera looked back at him. "This is Peter," Evelyn said. "The youngest." Peter looked at Vera's hat, which had a feather in it. "Bird," he said, pointing. "It's a pheasant feather," Vera said. "Bird," Peter said again, evidently satisfied with his own assessment. Something moved across Vera's face. Not quite a smile. Something quicker than that, almost involuntary. She smoothed it over immediately, but Evelyn caught it and filed it away. When they left, Vera shook Evelyn's hand at the door. "Mercer Ranch is a fine property," she said. "Colton has always maintained it well." "He has," Evelyn said. "The territory can be difficult for new arrivals," Vera said, "particularly those with substantial family obligations." "Substantial families are also substantial assets," Evelyn said. "In my experience." Vera looked at her. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to establish that Vera had heard the response and was choosing how to receive it. "Indeed," she said finally. And then she was in her carriage and gone. Constance looked back once from the carriage. Her expression was harder to read than Vera's. Something between curiosity and a sympathy she was keeping carefully neutral. Evelyn closed the door and stood in the main room for a moment. "How did it go?" Clara said from the kitchen doorway. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "We'll find out." What they found out came in stages. The dinner at the Duchamp house happened. Colton was not invited, which he received with the equanimity of a man who'd never much liked Harlan Duchamp's dinners to begin with. But 2 weeks later, a woman named Mrs. Aldine Pruitt stopped by the ranch on the thin pretense of returning a pot that Colton had apparently lent to her late husband 3 years ago. She was a widow herself, about 60, with the pragmatic warmth of a woman who had survived enough to stop caring about most of the things people used to keep each other apart. She stayed for 2 hours and ate lunch and told Evelyn more about Caldwell Creek in that time than Evelyn had learned in 2 months. "Vera Duchamp told Margaret Holloway that you were direct," Mrs. Pruitt said, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "Is that good or bad?" Evelyn asked. From Vera, direct means you didn't flinch and you didn't flatter, and she couldn't find the angle. Mrs. Pruitt accepted more coffee. She respects that even when she doesn't like it. She doesn't like much she can't manage. Am I going to be a problem for her? You're already a problem for her, Mrs. Pruitt said cheerfully. The question is whether you're going to be the kind of problem she decides to absorb or the kind she decides to remove. Which is more likely? Mrs. Pruitt looked at her steadily. Depends on Colton, she said. Colton Mercer's been in this county for 14 years. He's never caused trouble, and he's never looked for standing, and he's kept to himself in a way that people respected even when they didn't understand it. If he stands behind you, clearly, publicly, not just by keeping you out here on the ranch, then you're his business, and his name covers you. If he's ambiguous about it, Vera will fill the ambiguity with whatever serves her best. Evelyn thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it that evening, and she was still thinking about it when she heard the commotion in town that Saturday. Colton had taken her and the older children to town for supplies. The first time the whole family had made the trip together because the roads had finally firmed up enough for the wagon to manage it without risk, and because the children had been indoors for long enough that the friction was starting to show. It was a clear March day, cold still, but with the particular light that came when winter started thinking about ending, even if it wasn't ready to commit. Main Street in Caldwell Creek was not a long street. A general store, a dry goods, a bank, a post office, a saloon, a small hotel, a feed store, and a scattering of other establishments that various people had decided the town needed. On a Saturday, the boardwalks were busy with the commerce of a community that didn't have many other days to transact its business. People looked. She'd expected that. 9 children were going to draw eyes regardless of context, and the specific context of Colton Mercer accompanying them drew more. She could feel the looking, the boardwalk conversations that paused as they passed, the specific geometry of people orienting toward them without appearing to do so. Clara walked beside Evelyn, straight-backed, and paying attention to nothing that wasn't directly in front of her. Wyatt walked on the other side of Colton, which had become a habitual positioning that nobody had arranged. The trouble started at the general store. It started specifically with a woman named Lorelei Fitch, who was the wife of one of the Duchamp sons-in-law and who occupied the social tier just below Vera Duchamp, with the anxious precision of someone who understood that their position was contingent on proximity to the right people. She was in the general store when they arrived, she and 2 other women, shopping or appearing to shop, and the shift in the room when Evelyn walked in was something Evelyn had felt before and recognized immediately. The storekeeper, Gunderson, was a heavy-set, amiable man who seemed genuinely unbothered by anything happening in his store as long as people paid for things. He greeted Colton, nodded to Evelyn, and went back to his inventory. The 3 women continued their conversation at the counter. Audible enough. The children alone would cost more than the ranch brings in, Lorelei Fitch said, not to anyone in particular, and not about anything in particular, and entirely about this. Though I suppose a man who's been alone long enough loses perspective on practical matters. One of the other women made a murmuring sound that could have meant anything. I wonder that the county doesn't say something, Lorelei continued, about arrangements that are irregular. For the sake of the children, if nothing else. Evelyn kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her. She was aware of Clara next to her, of the stillness that had come into Clara's posture. She was aware of the twins behind her, who were old enough to understand tone, if not content. She was aware of Peter on her hip, who was looking at the jars on the shelves with serene unconcern. She was also aware of Colton, who had been at the far end of the store looking at something with Wyatt, and who had now gone entirely still. Lorelei Fitch said something else. Evelyn didn't catch all of it, something about charity cases and the difficulty of knowing where one stood when the standard shifted, but she caught enough. Colton crossed the store. He didn't cross it quickly or with any visible anger, which might have been easier to manage. He crossed it with the unhurried purpose of a man who had decided something and was going to say it once, clearly, and then it would be said. He stopped near the counter. He looked at Lorelei Fitch directly, which caused her to stop talking with the abrupt halt of someone who had been expecting to have the room to themselves and found they did not. "Mrs. Fitch," he said. His voice was even. "I need to say something." Lorelei Fitch had the presence of mind to arrange her face into something neutral. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Evelyn Harper is going to be my wife," Colton said. "She and her children are my family. Whatever arrangements you and your associates find irregular are arrangements I've made deliberately, and I'll stand behind them in this store and in any other room in this county." He held her gaze. "If you have concerns about the welfare of children, I'd ask you to direct them somewhere that actually needs concern. Mine are well." The store was quiet. Gunderson was examining something behind his counter with sudden intense focus. The other two women had gone very still. Lorelei Fitch's face did several things in quick succession. She landed on something that was intended to look like dignity and said, "I'm sure I didn't mean anything offensive, Mr. Mercer." "I'm sure you didn't," he said in the tone of a man who was sure of exactly the opposite and was choosing not to spend more time on it. He came back to Evelyn. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something she didn't fully have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, though it was in that direction. More like the specific, complicated feeling of watching someone do a difficult thing right. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, so only he heard. "I know," he said. "I wanted it to be clear." "It's clear," she said. He picked up the list she'd given him that morning and went to find the rest of what they needed. She turned back to the shelf she'd been studying before everything happened and finished what she was doing, because what else did you do? You finished what you were doing. Wyatt appeared beside her. He'd witnessed the whole thing from the middle of the store. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, that 15-year-old version of suppressing something that wanted out. "You all right?" she said quietly. "He didn't have to do that," Wyatt said. His voice had the rough quality of someone working hard to keep something contained. "No," she agreed. "He didn't." Wyatt looked at the shelf. Then, "Most men don't." She didn't answer that, because she couldn't, because he was right, and the truth of it was something she didn't have a clean response to. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He didn't pull away, which was Wyatt's version of significant, and went to find Clara. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. Not the bad kind of quiet, the kind that had weight in it, the kind that meant things were being processed that couldn't be processed out loud. The twins were subdued. May held Bess and didn't say anything. Sophie sat with the wooden horse in her hands. Wyatt rode ahead of the wagon on one of the ranch horses. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat. Something had changed in the line of them. She couldn't name it precisely. He held himself the same way, generally, but there was something different in the forward lean, something less braced against an anticipated impact. That evening, she found him in the barn after dinner. He was brushing down one of the horses, which was the thing he did when he needed to be doing something with his hands, while his mind worked through something else. She sat on the bench inside the barn door and let him work. After a while, he said, "When he said that, in the store, he said his family." "He did," Evelyn said. "He meant us. He meant all of us, yes." Wyatt kept brushing. The horse shifted its weight, turned its head briefly, went back to being a horse. "He didn't ask me," Wyatt said. "No," she said. "He didn't. I don't know if I—" He stopped. Started differently. "I'm not saying I didn't want him to. I'm saying he didn't ask." She thought about that. "You're right," she said. "I'll talk to him." Wyatt looked at her then. "I'm not asking you to fix it," he said, with the specific emphasis of 15-year-old who needed to be clear about that. "I know. I'm just saying it out loud." "I know that too," she said, "and it's important that you said it out loud." He went back to the horse. She stayed on the bench for a while longer, in the barn smell of hay and horses and cold timber, listening to the rhythmic sound of the brush. She talked to Colton that night. She explained what Wyatt had said, or as much of it as felt like hers to explain, and Colton listened in the way he listened, all the way through, without interrupting or forming his response visibly before she'd finished. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment. "I should have talked to him first," he said. "Yes, I was angry," he said. "Not at you, at that woman and what she was implying, and I said what needed saying, and I didn't think through who else I was speaking for when I said it." "He needs to hear that," she said. "I'll tell him." He did, the next morning, before the rest of the household was properly up. She didn't know what was said. She was in the kitchen, and she heard the barn door, and then quiet for a long time, and then the barn door again. But when Wyatt came in for breakfast, he was different in the indefinable way he'd been changing since February, one wall further down than it had been the day before. He sat down across from Colton and said, "You should know I can't promise anything about how long it takes me to adjust to things." Colton looked at him. "That's fair. I'm not—" Wyatt picked at the edge of the table. "I'm not trying to be difficult." "I know you're not," Colton said. "I'm not trying to rush you." "Okay," Wyatt said. "Okay," Colton said. That was apparently all it required. The weeks that followed were not easy. The weeks that followed were the hard, daily, incrementally improving work of 11 people building something that none of them had a template for, which meant they made up the template as they went, and it was imperfect and occasionally messy and always honest. The town adjusted, slowly in the frontier way, not with any ceremony of acceptance, but with the practical acknowledgement that the Mercers, as people were starting to call them collectively, were a functioning household on solid land with a good reputation and a steady record, and that these were the things that mattered most when February came around and you needed to know who your neighbors were. Mrs. Pruitt brought her sister to visit and stayed for 3 hours. The schoolmaster Beecham told Colton that Thomas and George, while exhausting, were learning faster than any students he'd had in 5 years, which he delivered as a criticism, but which Clara correctly identified as a compliment. Vera Duchamp did not come back, but she also did not, from what Mrs. Pruitt reported, continue her original line of conversation about the irregular arrangements at Mercer Ranch, which was not exactly an endorsement, but was the absence of active opposition, which was its own kind of territory gained. Spring arrived in April with the abruptness it usually managed in this part of the territory. 1 week cold and the next week not. The ground softening, the creek running with snowmelt, the cottonwoods starting the slow business of leaf. Evelyn put in the garden on the sheltered west side. Clara helped. Iris helped, with the intense, slightly chaotic helpfulness of a 7-year-old who wanted to participate in everything. Sophie came and watched, and then one afternoon began planting seeds with the same focused care she brought to everything she did. The children were not, in any measurable way, the same children who'd stood on a frozen platform in January. May had stopped carrying Bess everywhere. Bess now lived on a shelf in the bedroom, which was either abandonment or elevation depending on how you looked at it, and May had opinions on the distinction. Daniel had developed a serious interest in the repair of things after the boot project with Colton, and Hob had started letting him work on equipment in the workshop under supervision, an arrangement that suited Daniel's focused temperament and Hob's preference for quiet. Iris had become indispensable in the kitchen in the way of children who genuinely enjoyed the work rather than tolerated it. The twins were still the twins. Loud, energetic, perpetually in negotiation with each other and with the world. But their energy had found channels, and channeled energy, Evelyn had always believed, was not a problem, but a resource. Peter recovered fully. He had the complete, uncomplicated recovery of the very young, as if the illness had happened to a different body, and his current body had no memory of it. He followed Colton every morning. He said Colton's name in the 2-year-old's version of it, Colt, flattened to 1 syllable, which was not something anyone encouraged or discouraged, it simply happened, and Colton received it without comment, though she'd seen him look at Peter sometimes with an expression that wasn't quite anything she had a word for. Sophie talked. Not all the time, so she was not going to become a child who talked all the time. That was not who Sophie was, and it turned out that Sophie's silence had always been partly temperament and only partly response to circumstance. But she talked when she had something to say, which turned out to be more often than anyone had expected, and what she said was frequently so precisely observed that it stopped conversation in its tracks. Wyatt, on a Tuesday in April, came in from fence work with Colton and sat down at the table where Clara was helping the younger ones with their lessons and said, without preamble, "Beecham said I could start secondary work this fall, if I wanted." Clara looked at him. "Do you want?" Wyatt looked at the table. "Maybe," he said. "There's a surveying program in Cheyenne. You can apprentice at 15 if your schoolwork's complete enough." Evelyn, who was in the kitchen, heard this and said nothing. She waited. Wyatt said, "I'd have to talk to Colton about the ranch work." "You'd have to talk to Colton and to me," she said from the kitchen. A pause. "Yeah," he said. "To both of you." She heard the word settle. Both of you. The way it landed in the room, what it implied about how he'd arranged things in his mind. She kept her hands in the bread dough she was working and didn't make anything of it out loud. Later that night, when the house was quiet, she told Colton what Wyatt had said. Colton listened. Then he said, "Surveying's a good trade. Better than a good trade. There's a decade of work in this territory for anyone who can do it." "He'd need to be in Cheyenne part of the year," she said. "He's 15, Colton said. "He's not going to be here forever regardless. Better he goes with a plan than without one." She looked at him. "That's a generous way to think about it." "It's a practical way," he said. "The ranch will still be here when he comes back. And if he doesn't come back—" He shrugged. "That's his right. We don't keep people, Mrs. Harper. We give them something to come from." She looked at him for a long time, at the scar along his jaw and the steady, unsentimental intelligence in his face and the large hands folded on the table. "Evelyn," she said. He looked at her. "You've been calling me Mrs. Harper for 3 months," she said. "I think we're past that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Evelyn." "That's better," she said. Outside, the April wind was the new kind, softer, with something underneath it that wasn't quite warmth but was working in that direction. Inside, the fire was low and steady, and the house was full of sleeping children and the particular inhabited quiet that she'd started somewhere in the last few weeks to think of as hers. Not his, not borrowed, hers. She'd stopped sleeping badly somewhere around the middle of March and hadn't particularly noticed the change until she woke one morning in early April and realized she'd been sleeping through the night for weeks. That was the kind of thing you only noticed in retrospect, the absence of a difficulty once it had quietly resolved. She thought about the platform, the frozen boards and the 6 rejections and the darkening sky and the children lined up behind her. She thought about standing there after everyone else had left and not knowing why exactly she was still there, only that leaving felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. She thought about what it had cost her to stand there, and what standing there had eventually returned. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for riding through the storm." He considered that. The fire shifted. "Thank you for still being there when I got there," he said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the ranch lay quiet under the April dark, and 11 people shared a roof with all the ordinary imperfect difficulty of people who had chosen each other and were still, every day, in the process of figuring out what that meant. Spring in Wyoming arrived the way it always did. Not gently, not with the soft cinematic progression that people from softer climates imagined when they thought about seasons changing. It arrived in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost. Mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon. The cottonwoods along the creek put out leaves that a late April cold snap then reconsidered, and the leaves hung there for a week, uncertain, before the weather finally committed. Evelyn found the uncertainty appropriate. She was in the business of uncertain things committing. The conversation about marriage happened on a Sunday morning in late April, which was not a day she'd have picked if she'd been picking. It wasn't a planned conversation. It came out of a long silence over coffee, after the younger children had gone outside, and Claire was upstairs and Wyatt was in the barn, and the house had achieved one of its rare moments of actual quiet. And in that quiet, Colton put down his cup and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what properly means for 2 people in our particular situation, and I haven't come up with a satisfying answer, so I'm going to just ask you directly." "All right," she said. He looked at her across the table. The morning light came through the east window and made everything in the kitchen look more honest than it usually did. The worn surface of the table, the good quality but not new dishes on the shelf, the lines in both their faces that weren't there 10 years ago. "Evelyn," he said, "will you marry me?" He said it without decoration, without the performance of romance that neither of them had ever been much suited for. He said it the way he said most things, directly, meaning it, leaving out what didn't need to be there. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the platform, the way she always did when a moment required context. She'd started doing that somewhere in the last months, using the platform as the fixed point to measure from. She thought about the frozen boards, and the blizzard coming, and 6 rejections, and Peter's weight against her shoulder, and the particular quality of courage required to stand still when every reasonable instinct said to move. She thought about what this man had done over the last 3 months, which was not the large dramatic things, not the storm ride to get the doctor, not the speech in Gunderson's store, though those mattered, But the small, consistent things that were actually harder to sustain, the harness mending in the evenings, Daniel's boot, the carved wooden horse left where Sophie could find it, the coffee made before anyone else was up, the patience with Wyatt that had never been performed and therefore never ran out, the way he'd said both of you, speaking to Evelyn about Wyatt's school plans and what that choice of words revealed about how he understood the structure of what they'd built. Nobody had done the small, consistent things in a very long time. She hadn't realized how much she'd been carrying the absence of that until it was present again. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Not dramatically, just the specific breath of a man who had been holding something and was now setting it down. "Good," he said. She almost laughed. "Good," she said back. They sat there for another minute in the morning light, and then Peter came in through the back door with mud on both boots and part of his coat, requiring immediate attention, and the moment was over. But it had been a complete moment. It didn't need anything added to it. They told the children that evening after dinner. Colton had suggested they do it separately. Tell Clara and Wyatt first privately, before the general announcement, and Evelyn had agreed because that was the right instinct. Clara received the news with a long, level look at Colton and then at her mother, and then she said, "Are you happy?" to Evelyn, which was Clara's fundamental question about everything and had been since she was small. "I think I'm getting there," Evelyn said honestly, which is the most I've been able to say about anything in a long time. Clara nodded. "That's good enough," she said. Then to Colton, "She works too hard and she doesn't eat enough when she's managing a crisis. She'll tell you she's fine when she isn't." Colton looked at Evelyn. "I've noticed," he said. "I'm right here," Evelyn said. "That's all I wanted to say," Clara said, and went back to the kitchen. Wyatt was harder. He always was, and that hadn't changed entirely, and she didn't expect it to. She'd made her peace with the fact that some things in Wyatt would take years to fully resolve, and some things might never fully resolve, and that both of those were true simultaneously, and neither of them negated the progress that was already real. He was in the barn when Colton went to find him. Evelyn stayed in the house because this was something Colton needed to do on his own, and because Wyatt needed to receive it from Colton directly without his mother present as a buffer or a witness. She knew this the way she knew most things about her children, not from any single moment, but from the accumulated data of years of careful attention. She didn't know exactly what was said. She knew Colton was gone for 40 minutes. She knew when he came back in, his face had the quality of someone who'd had a conversation that had cost something and was glad it had. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything immediately, and she gave him the space to find the words. "He cried," Colton said finally. Quietly, like it was something private. "He turned away so I couldn't see him properly. But he cried." She looked at the fire. "He said—" Colton stopped. Started again. "He said he wasn't crying because he was sad. He said he didn't know why he was crying." "I do," she said. "Yeah," Colton said. "I think I do too." She understood it because she knew Wyatt. He'd been braced for so long, against loss, against departure, against the inevitable disappointment of men who seemed all right and then weren't, that when the thing he'd been braced against simply didn't happen, when it kept not happening day after day until the evidence was undeniable, the structure he'd built to hold against it had nothing left to do. And structures that no longer serve their purpose don't quietly retire. They fall. Wyatt crying in the barn was not grief. It was the specific, disorienting release of someone discovering that the wall they'd been holding up was no longer needed, and the effort of all those months coming down at once. He came in for supper that night and said nothing about any of it, and ate 2 portions, which was normal for him, and afterward told Daniel to stop drumming on the table with his fork, which was also normal for him. And she watched him and saw, underneath all of that, something that she hadn't seen in his face in a very long time. He looked like a boy who was home. The wedding was in June, on a clear Saturday morning with the kind of sky that Wyoming sometimes produced in summer, deep and specific and bluer than seemed reasonable. They did it at the ranch because neither of them was inclined to make it a public event, and because the people who mattered were already there. Mrs. Pruitt came because Mrs. Pruitt had become, in the months between January and June, something close to a genuine friend, the first Evelyn had made in years, the kind that didn't require performance or maintenance, the kind that simply existed and was reliable. She brought flowers from her garden, the first ones of the season, slightly crooked stems and everything, and put them in a jar on the table. Hob and Kate and Wren came because they were the ranch, and the ranch was present at everything that happened on it. Hob had put on a clean shirt, which Evelyn understood was a significant gesture from Hob. Kate brought a bottle of something that he set on the table without ceremony, and nobody asked about directly. Dr. Ferris came, which surprised her. He'd driven 4 miles on a Saturday to stand in a ranch yard for a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes. And when she said she hadn't expected him, he said, "You kept that boy alive in a blizzard with willow bark and cold compresses. I wanted to see how things turned out. Justice of the peace." Elkins performed the ceremony. The same Elkins who tried to send her to Mrs. Glennie's boarding house on the January platform. She hadn't forgotten that, and he appeared to be aware that she hadn't forgotten it, which gave their reacquaintance an interesting texture. He performed the ceremony correctly and without excess sentiment, which suited both of them. The children were arranged in front of them in the order they'd come down the train steps 6 months ago. Clara first, then Wyatt, then the twins, then May, with Bess tucked under one arm because some habits persisted, then Daniel, then Sophie, then Iris, then Peter, who was held by Clara because the ceremony required him to be still, a requirement he met for approximately 4 minutes before deciding otherwise. Evelyn wore the best dress she owned, which was dark blue wool, and had been good when she bought it, and was still good in the way of things made to last. She had not bought a new dress for the occasion. She'd considered it and decided against it, because the woman who was standing in this ranch yard was the same woman who'd stood on a frozen platform in January in the coat she already owned, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise by appearing in something she'd acquired specifically to mark the distance between then and now. The distance was real. She didn't need to dress it. Colton wore his good coat and had done something about his beard, which was to say he'd trimmed it, not removed it, which was the right call. He stood beside her with the steady, undemonstrative presence that had been, from the beginning, the thing she'd trusted most about him. Not his words, not his gestures. His presence, which was consistent in the way of something built on a solid foundation rather than assembled for display. Elkins asked the questions. They answered them. When it was done, Colton took her hand and held it, which he'd done with a certain careful deliberateness. And she let him. And that was that. The twins cheered because they were the twins. Peter said "Colt" and reached for him, which made Ferris make a sound that might have been a laugh. May held Bess up slightly, as though Bess had earned a better view. Clara watched with her gray eyes and said nothing, which was Clara's version of approval. Sophie held the wooden horse. Wyatt stood at the back of the group with his hands in his coat pockets. When Evelyn caught his eye, he gave her a short, definitive nod. She gave him one back. That was the ceremony. There was food afterward. Clara and Mrs. Pruitt had organized it between themselves without telling Evelyn what they were planning. And the result was substantial and good and slightly chaotic in the way of food produced by people who were cooking for 11-plus guests in a ranch kitchen. Cade's bottle turned out to be a decent rye whiskey, and Hob and Ferris and Colton had some of it, and Mrs. Pruitt had a small amount that she pronounced acceptable. Evelyn did not drink whiskey, but she had the cider that Clara produced from somewhere, and she stood in the yard in the June sun with the cider in her hand and looked at the ranch around her. The garden was coming in on the west side. The rows she and Clara and Sophie had put in April were real now, visible and growing, the particular vivid green of things that were new. The barn was solid. The fences Wyatt and Colton had repaired through February and March ran straight to the east. The south pasture had the cattle on it, small dark shapes at this distance, going about their uncomplicated business. The cottonwoods along the creek had fully committed to their leaves. Whatever doubts they'd had in April resolved. She stood there and felt the specific weight of the moment. Not the wedding specifically, but the accumulation of moments that had led to it, and the understanding of what it had cost to be standing here. Not romantically, concretely. She understood the cost with the precision of someone who had paid it in actual installments, in actual cold, in actual debt and loss, and the long, exhausting work of keeping 9 people alive and moving forward when the forward direction was not obvious. She didn't think that cost had been worth it in any clean, transactional sense. Suffering wasn't an investment that returned something proportional. That was the lie people told to make suffering bearable, and she'd never quite believed it. What she believed was different. She believed that the cost had been paid, and that it hadn't destroyed her, and that what existed on the other side of it was real in a way that things given easily were not. The yard, the ranch, the children in the sunlight, Colton talking to Ferris near the fence. This was real. Not because she'd earned it, because she'd survived to reach it, and survival had its own kind of grace. The years that followed did not unfold smoothly. She would say that plainly now, from the distance of time. They were not smooth years. They were good years, but goodness and smoothness were not the same thing, and she'd stopped confusing them long ago. There was a drought 2 summers after the wedding that took half the cattle and required decisions so difficult she and Colton sat up past midnight more than once working through numbers that didn't want to balance. They got through it, but getting through it meant taking on a debt that took 4 years to fully retire, and those 4 years had their own shape of difficulty. Not crisis, but the ongoing weight of something owed. Wyatt went to Cheyenne at 16 for the surveying apprenticeship, which he'd worked toward with the same single-minded focus he brought to everything. He came back at 18, completed the program, and spent 2 years working the territory before setting up a practice in a town 40 miles east called Harrow Creek, where he eventually married a woman named Lena, who was a doctor's daughter and apparently as forthright as he was, which Evelyn counted as evidence of good judgment. He came back for every significant occasion and sent letters between them, which was more than she'd allowed herself to hope for when he was 15, and defending himself against hope with everything he had. Clara stayed until she was 21. She taught school, first the younger children at the ranch, then at the school in Caldwell Creek when Beecham retired and the county needed someone qualified, which Clara was. She was an exceptional teacher in the way of people whose intelligence included the patience to make their intelligence accessible to others. She married at 23, a man named Owen, who was a civil engineer working on the railroad expansion, and moved to Laramie, which was far enough away that the visits were events, and close enough that they happened. The twins diverged as they got older, which was not something she'd expected, but probably should have. Thomas turned out to have a genuine gift for numbers, and eventually went into land management, working with Wyatt's surveying office on property assessments across 3 counties. George turned out to have a gift for animals, not just the cattle instinct that the ranch had always given him, but a broader, studied understanding of livestock management that eventually made him one of the most sought-after ranch consultants in the territory. They remained in close contact with each other and with the family in the particular bond of people who had shared everything early in life and therefore understood each other in ways nobody else quite could. May grew up to be a woman who kept animals, not the ranch livestock, though she helped with those too, but strays and injured things that she brought home with the same steady benevolence she'd always had. The same warmth that had named a cloth rabbit Bess and treated her as a member of the household. She stayed near Caldwell Creek her whole life, which suited her. She married a farmer named Titus Greer, a quiet, kind man who was not surprised by anything May brought through the door, and she ran a household so warm and alive that the neighbors' children came over and stayed for dinner the way children naturally migrated toward comfort. Daniel became a craftsman. It started with hob and the boot and the workshop, and it built over years into a genuine skill with wood and metal and the mechanics of things, how they fit together, how they broke, how they could be made better. He set up a repair shop in Caldwell Creek at 17 and expanded it at 22 into a full workshop operation. He was not the most talkative of people, but his work spoke with a clarity that didn't need language. Sophie became a teacher like Clara, though in a different way. Clara taught with authority, with the clear structure of someone who believed in the transferability of knowledge and worked deliberately toward it. Sophie taught with listening. She had a particular gift for children who struggled, the ones who didn't fit the standard approaches, the ones who sat in classrooms and felt the classroom was built for someone else. She understood them because she'd once been one. She stayed in the territory her whole life, working first in Caldwell Creek and then at a school established in a smaller settlement to the north, where she married a man named Garrett, who was a carpenter and whose quietness matched her own. Iris ran the kitchen. That was the plain truth of it. She'd always run the kitchen, and she continued to run the kitchen, and eventually running a kitchen became running a boarding house in Caldwell Creek that she opened at 20 with money she'd been saving since she was 12. And the boarding house became known across 3 counties as the place where the food was good and the rooms were clean, and Mrs. Aldridge, her married name, knew everything that was happening in the county before it happened, which was both useful and, on occasion, formidable. Peter grew up on the ranch. Of all the children, he was the one who stayed closest to what Mercer Ranch actually was. The land, the cattle, the daily physical work of keeping a productive property functional. He was Colton's shadow for years, and then he became Colton's right hand, and then he became the person who understood the operation as well as anyone alive. He had Colton's patience and his mother's directness, and a wit that had come from somewhere else entirely, sharp and dry and occasionally startling. He married at 24 and brought his wife, a woman named Ruth, to the ranch, and the next generation of Mercers began in the same main room where Evelyn had first held him through a fever and watched a house become a home. Colton. She would say about Colton only what was true, which was that he was not a perfect man, and she would not have trusted a perfect man. He was impatient sometimes when things didn't work the way he'd planned, and he carried his own losses in a way that he still sometimes chose to carry alone when she could see clearly that the carrying alone was harder than the sharing would have been. She told him so when it was relevant, and he received it with varying degrees of grace depending on the day, which was honest and therefore acceptable. He was also, consistently and without decoration, a man who showed up on Tuesdays. She had told him that was what she wanted in those early weeks when neither of them had been certain of anything, and it had turned out to be what he was already built for. Not the grand gestures, those were easy, those were the things you did when you were trying to prove something. The Tuesday behavior, the maintenance of commitment over time, in conditions both good and difficult, without requiring the difficulty to justify itself by being dramatic enough. He did that. He did that for the rest of the time they had, which was more than 30 years, and which she was aware was not owed to anyone, and which she was aware could have been shorter, and which she took nothing for granted about. There was a morning, she was 53, which meant Colton was in his early 70s and had developed the stiff-hipped walk of a man who'd spent half a century on horseback and was now paying the compound interest on that decision. When she stood on the covered porch and looked at the ranch in the October light, the light was the fall kind, low in particular, the kind that made everything look like it was about to be remembered rather than simply experienced. The south pasture was brown with the end of the season. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold. The garden had been put to bed for the winter, the last of it harvested and stored, the turned earth dark and specific smelling. Peter was in the barn with his son, who was 9, and already following his father around with the focused attention of a child who understood early what he loved. Through the barn door she could hear the low sounds of them working together, the specific father and son language of shared task. A letter had come that week from Wyatt, from Harrow Creek, which she'd read twice and set on the kitchen table. He was considering running for county commissioner, he said. He thought he could do some good, and he wanted to know what she thought. The question still made something in her chest do a complicated thing. Not pride, or not only pride. Something that had to do with a 15-year-old on a ranch porch in a blizzard, saying, "I don't know if I," and stopping, and all the distance between that and this. May had sent a note with it. She was planning to come for the harvest, she said, and was bringing 3 children and probably 2 animals, and apologized in advance for the animals. Evelyn had written back that the animals were fine. She stood on the porch and let October do what October did, which was remind you that things ended and continued simultaneously, that the ending of one season was not the ending of everything, that the specific configuration of any given moment was temporary, but the underlying structure of things could be, if you built it carefully and kept building it, even when the building was hard, more durable than any particular arrangement of people or weather or circumstance. She thought about this platform. She thought about it the way she thought about all the fixed points, not with longing, not with regret, not with the particular retroactive drama that memory sometimes applied to things, making them more epic in recollection than they'd felt in the moment. She thought about it plainly. She thought, that was the day, and this is the day, and between those 2 days is a life, and it was harder than she'd thought it would be, and it built things she hadn't known she was capable of building, the things she'd learned, the thing she'd turned over enough times that she trusted it now as more than observation, trusted it as one of the few things she actually knew, was that survival was not the same as living, but it was the precondition. You had to get through the platform first. You had to stand there after everyone else had gone, not because it was dignified or strategic, but because leaving felt like the wrong thing, and you trusted that instinct even when you couldn't defend it with logic. And then you had to accept what came next without insisting it looked like what you'd imagined. You had to let the good things be good in the specific ways they were actually good rather than the ways you'd planned for. You had to let Colton be Colton rather than William or Robert. Let Wyatt be Wyatt rather than a boy who has passed his damage. Let Sophie find her voice on her own terms rather than the ones that would have been easier for you to manage. You had to be willing to be a specific person in a specific situation rather than the version of yourself that could have handled things better if things had been different. She had not handled everything well. She had been short-tempered sometimes and frightened sometimes, and there were decisions she'd made that she'd return to change if returning were a thing you got to do. She'd been too slow to reach some of her children during the bad years, and too protective of others. She'd been harder than she needed to be in some rooms, and softer than was useful in others. She'd gotten through it, all of it. Not intact. Intact was not the goal and never had been. Intact suggested an original wholeness that you were trying to preserve, and she'd stopped believing in that early. The goal was forward. The goal was still standing. The goal was the 9 children who were adults now, living specific, imperfect, recognizable lives in the world, and the ranch behind her that had held through drought and debt and the long winters and the man inside making coffee badly, as he always had, as he always would. Colton came out with 2 cups. He moved slowly, the hip bothering him the way it bothered him in the cold, and he didn't mention it because mentioning it was not his habit, and complaining about pain was not his practice. He handed her a cup and stood beside her on the porch. She looked at him. At 72, he was different. That was the plain word. The face she'd been looking at for 30 years had more weather in it, and the eyes were a little slower, and he'd gone entirely gray long ago. But the quality was the same, the presence, the consistency. Peter's talking about expanding the South pasture, he said. I know, she said. He talked to me about it last week. What do you think? I think he knows this land better than either of us do at this point, she said. I think we should let him make the decision. Colton considered this. Hard to let go of something you built, he said. We didn't build it, she said. You built it. We kept building it. Peter's the one who'll carry it. She looked at the pasture. That's how it's supposed to work. He drank his coffee. The October light moved across the ranch the way light moved at this time of year, low and deliberate, making ordinary things look considered. You ever think about that platform? He said. She looked at him. He almost never said that word. Platform. Had never quite made it part of their regular vocabulary of shared history. She'd expected him to leave it where it was, in the category of things that didn't need to be spoken to remain real. Sometimes, she said. I think about it, he said. He looked out at the cottonwoods. I think about almost not going. The weather was bad. I was late. I told myself it was done. You told me, she said. I think about that a lot, he said. What I would have... He stopped. What this would have looked like from the other side of that. She thought about it too. She thought about what her particular life might have looked like if the man who'd almost turned back because of the weather had in fact turned back. She'd have found something. She'd always found something. Not because she was exceptional, but because she didn't have the option of not finding something. She would have found a way with $7.40 and 9 children to make a life that functioned, because the children required it and she was built for requirement. But it would have been a different life, and different was too small a word for what she meant, and there wasn't a bigger one available, so she left it at that. I'm glad you didn't turn back, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. The barn door opened and Peter came out with his son, the boy running ahead toward the house for something, Peter following with the unhurried walk of a man who lived on the land and moved accordingly. He looked up at the porch, at both of them, and raised a hand. She raised hers back. She thought, that is my son. She thought, and the one inside writing a letter about county commissioner is my son. And the one in Laramie, and the one in the East classroom, and the one running the boarding house, and the one with the workshop, and the one who kept animals, and the one who listened. 9 children. None of them easy. All of them real. All of them in ways she could trace and ways she couldn't. The accumulated product of a woman who had stood on a frozen platform in January and refused to leave until it was absolutely clear there was nothing left to wait for. And then, when something arrived, had the sense to recognize it, even if it arrived looking completely unlike what she'd imagined. That was the thing. That was the plain, unglamorous, completely ordinary, and completely astonishing thing. You didn't always get to choose what the good things looked like. You only got to choose whether to be present when they arrived. She'd been present. She'd kept showing up, on platforms and in kitchens and beside sick children in the middle of the night and in ranch yards in January blizzards and in the daily ordinary hours that were not dramatic and did not make good stories, but were, in the end, the material that everything else was built from. The coffee was not good. Colton had never made good coffee, and she had stopped mentioning it years ago, and he had never improved. And this was fine. This was, in the specific way of small, persistent imperfections that you stopped trying to fix because they were part of the texture of a life rather than a problem with it. Completely fine. She drank it. The October light moved. Somewhere inside, she could hear Iris's daughter, visiting from town, playing something on the small piano that Daniel had built and Clara had taught Sophie to play, and Sophie had taught the children after her, an instrument that had been worked on and repaired and kept in tune across 3 decades and showed all of it in its surface. The music was imperfect. The player was still learning. It was the most appropriate sound she could imagine for a life like this. Not finished, not polished, still becoming, played by someone who hadn't yet mastered it but was fully committed to the attempt. She stood on the porch with her bad coffee and her husband and October around them. And the ranch was not perfect, and the years had been hard, and the life was the specific, difficult, real one she'd actually lived rather than any imagined version, and she wouldn't have arranged it differently. Not because everything had been good, but because the particular shape of it, including the hard parts, had made the particular family standing in it, including their hard parts, and you could not separate one from the other. The widow everyone dismissed. She almost smiled at that. The widow everyone dismissed was 53 years old and drinking bad coffee in October, and she had built something that would still be standing when she wasn't, which was all you could really ask for, and more than most people got, and she knew it. She didn't say any of this out loud. Some things were true without needing to be spoken, which was itself a kind of wealth, the particular comfort of a life full enough that the most important things in it could afford to be quiet. She finished her coffee. She went inside. The music continued.